Across 4 distant landscapes, stones the size of houses stand cut, lifted and locked into place with surgical precision. Then the trail goes dead. No blueprints, no journals, no clear tool marks, just alignments that still hit the sky like a countdown. So who moved them? How did they do it? And what part of our ancient story was never written down? Something in the human past refuses to stay quiet. Stone keeps its own counsel, and it endures. Even when names vanish, the ground still presents decisions made with startling confidence. In archaeology, mystery is not a license to imagine. It is a demand to measure, to compare, and to doubt our first impressions. We inherit the finished surfaces of ancient choices, but not the conversations that produced them. So the work begins where certainty ends. This film follows the world's most unexplained archaeological discoveries as problems with edges, not legends without limits. We will treat unexplained as a technical condition, evidence that is real, patterns that are measurable, and conclusions that are not yet earned. Across continents, megaliths and anomalies share a strange quality. They look intentional from every angle, yet their intentions are hard to pin down. Some stand in open-air like declarations, others hide in plain sight, and others are sealed beneath layers that read like time itself. Our central question is simple to ask and difficult to answer. What do these structures reveal about ancient civilizations, and what crucial pieces of history are still missing? To approach it, we will follow the traces that survive: stone selection, transport routes, joinery, sediment, and the quiet mathematics of placement. We begin with a discipline that prizes context over spectacle, because context is where explanations either hold or collapse. A stone is never just a stone. Its geology points to a source, its scars hint at tools, and its setting ties it to water, paths, horizons, and power. Yet absence is part of the evidence, and it can mislead as easily as it can illuminate. When monuments are robbed for building material, when soils are churned by centuries of farming, when whole sites are buried on purpose, the past leaves a record that is both present and incomplete. So we will use the methods that turn silence into probability: stratigraphy, radiocarbon, luminescence, toolmark analysis, and the careful mapping of landscapes. We will test alignments without worshipping them, and we will weigh engineering claims against friction, leverage, sequence, and labour. But this is not only a story about technique, because technique alone cannot explain why people invested effort beyond immediate survival. Megaliths are also social instruments, gathering places, boundary markers, memorials, and statements that outlast a lifetime. In Belgium, we will walk a modern landscape where time has edited the past, leaving punctuation where whole sentences once stood. In Chile, we will move through extremes that preserve marks with unnerving clarity, then force us to ask what kind of memory needed such maintenance. In Lebanon, we will face architecture that performs authority in stone, where scale becomes policy and logistics becomes theatre. And in Turkey, we will descend into layered construction and deliberate burial, where sealing a place can be as meaningful as building it. As these case studies accumulate, a pattern will start to emerge, not a single lost blueprint, but a recurring human impulse to make place durable. The temptation will be to reach for one grand answer, and we will resist it, because similarity is not proof of connection. Instead, we will ask what can be demonstrated, what remains plausible, and what is simply unknown. We will confront the missing middle of deep history, those fragile links of knowledge, coordination, and motive that rarely survive without writing. By the end, the stakes will be clearer than any one monument. If we misread these sites, we misread the capabilities and priorities of entire societies. And if we treat mystery as impossibility, we trade human ingenuity for fantasy, then lose the chance to learn what the evidence still offers. This journey is an invitation to wonder with rigour, and to let the stones keep their dignity. The past is not asking to be rescued by speculation. It is asking to be questioned well, before time erases the remaining clues. Before we begin, let us know in the comments below where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in for a journey, from Europe's edited fields to South America's stark extremes, from the Levant's colossal masonry to Anatolia's buried enclosures. We will follow 4 landscapes toward one synthesis. And with each step, the question will sharpen: what we can know, what we cannot, and what discoveries may still lie underfoot. Across the modern world, ancient stonework still interrupts our confidence in progress. We can lift skyscraper beams with cranes and computer-guided rigging, yet some prehistoric blocks feel misscaled to their time. Their surfaces are measurable, their weight is calculable, and their placement is undeniable. What remains unclear is the chain of decisions that made them real. Who ordered the work, who did it, and what counted as success? In bright daylight, these stones look ordinary from a distance, like rough outcrops. Up close, edges sharpen into intention, and joints tighten into geometry. You see faces that were flattened, corners that were squared, and contact points that were carefully tuned. You also see weathering that acts like a slow eraser, rounding tool scars into ambiguity. The monument remains, but the moment of building slips away. Archaeology begins with that tension between proof and silence, because the ground keeps results and hides motives. Ruins preserve actions, not intentions, and monuments outlast the names that built them. A standing stone can mark a place for millennia, while its meaning erodes in decades. A buried structure can survive intact, while the story of its builders disappears. The stones stay. The reasons often do not. That silence is not empty, and it is not mystical by itself. It is the normal condition of deep time, where most voices were never recorded. Before paper archives and durable inscriptions, memory lived in speech, ceremony, and repeated practice. When those practices stop, meaning can vanish in a generation, while the stone remains stubbornly present. The result is a landscape that feels like evidence without a caption. This series follows the most unexplained archaeological discoveries, without treating mystery as a shortcut. Some sites are famous because they are beautiful, and others because they are stubborn. They resist easy explanations even after careful measurement and excavation. The goal is not to romanticize the unknown, but to map what evidence supports. The goal is also to name what evidence is missing. Archaeology is the study of past human life through material remains, and it is more method than treasure hunt. It reads landscapes, layers, objects, and built forms as traces of behavior. It does not begin with legends, though it may compare them later. It begins with context, because a stone without context is only a stone. Context includes where an object lies, what lies above it, and what lies beside it. Context also includes what is absent, because missing pieces can be diagnostic. A monument without domestic debris may imply gathering rather than living. A tomb without bones may imply removal, reuse, or a ritual we do not yet recognize. Even the soil can be a record because compaction, ash lenses and microlayers form when people return repeatedly. Archaeology listens for those patterns, then asks what kind of life could have made them. Megalithic structures are large stone constructions made without modern machinery, and the term covers many architectures. They include standing stones set upright as markers or memorials. They include stone circles, cairns, and chambered tombs built from massive slabs. They include trilithons where two uprights carry a lintel like a doorway. They include terraces, retaining walls, and platforms that reshape entire hillsides. What makes a megalith impressive is not only mass but control. A heavy block can be dragged, but it must also be oriented, seated, and stabilized. Builders had to anticipate settling, frost heave, drainage, and the slow creep of soil. They also had to think in sequences, because a lintel cannot rise until uprights are secure. The stone is the visible outcome of planning, and planning implies shared knowledge. Ruins are the remains of buildings that have lost their original function, often through abandonment, collapse, or reuse. Monuments are structures built to be seen, remembered, and repeated in the mind. Buried structures are buildings sealed by sediment, collapse, or deliberate covering, sometimes preserving flaws like sealed pages. Anomalies are features that do not fit expected patterns of date, method, or purpose. Unexplained discoveries are not supernatural by default, but unresolved by current evidence. These enigmas matter because they set boundaries on what we think ancient societies could do. If we underestimate the past, we flatten human ingenuity into a simple timeline. If we overestimate it without evidence, we replace history with fantasy. The stakes are practical. How people organize labor, moved materials, and planned landscapes reveals power, belief, and survival. It also reveals what kinds of communities were possible without states, or before states became visible in texts. A project that requires hundreds of coordinated work hours implies leadership, scheduling, and some way to feed workers. A project that repeats a precise orientation implies measurement, whether by shadows, stars, or careful sightlines. When we confront a megalith, we are also confronting social technology. The stone asks a quiet question. What kind of society could afford this effort? The central question is simple and difficult. What do the world's most unexplained megaliths and anomalies reveal about ancient civilizations? What crucial pieces of history are still missing between stones and stories? To approach that question, we need a toolkit that can fail gracefully. Archaeologists rarely get a single decisive clue, and they rarely accept a single dramatic cause. They build hypotheses that can be tested, weakened, or replaced. They prefer explanations that match the evidence and require the fewest special assumptions. They also accept that some answers remain provisional for decades. The first tool is dating because timeframes limit what is possible. Relative dating orders events without giving a calendar year. Stratigraphy reads layers of soil and debris, where lower layers are usually older. It is not perfect. Burrowing animals, roots, and later digging can scramble layers, but it is foundational. Typology compares artifact styles, because tools and pottery change through time in patterned ways. If a stone platform sits above a layer of distinctive ceramics, it is likely later than those ceramics. Stratigraphy is also a study of formation, not just sequence. A clean layer of wind-blown silt suggests a pause in activity, while a mixed layer suggests disturbance. A floor surface can trap tiny clues, charcoal flecks, crushed bone, or phytoliths from plants, that hint at what happened there. Even when the monument is stone, the story often sits in the dirt beside it. The most careful excavations treat soil like a document. Absolute dating aims for calendar ranges, but every method has limits. Radiocarbon dating measures the decay of carbon-14 in once-living material, and it depends on calibration curves built from tree rings and other records. It works well for charcoal, bone, and seeds, but it cannot date stone directly. It can be distorted by contamination, old wood effects, and disturbed layers. It also becomes less precise as samples approach the method's practical limits. Radiocarbon results are also probabilities, not single years, and they must be read with caution. A date from charcoal may reflect when a tree grew, not when it was burned. A bone date may reflect diet effects in certain environments, shifting the apparent age. That is why archaeologists seek multiple samples from secure contexts. Agreement across samples builds confidence, while disagreement becomes a clue. When organic material is absent, other clocks become important. Optically stimulated luminescence dating can estimate when sediments last saw sunlight. It can date the burial of a wall's foundation trench or the ceiling of a floor. It demands careful sampling, because light exposure resets the signal. In some environments, lichenometry can estimate how long rock surfaces have been exposed, though it is sensitive to climate and species. These methods are powerful because they date events around the stone, not the stone itself. A trench fill can tell us when a monolith was set. A sediment layer against a wall can tell us when that wall was already standing. In the best cases, different clocks converge on the same window of time. In the hardest cases, the clocks disagree, and the disagreement becomes part of the mystery. Dating alone does not explain construction, so archaeologists trace materials. Petrography examines stone texture and mineral composition under the microscope, revealing grain size, cement, and fracture behavior. Geochemical sourcing compares elemental signatures to known quarries and outcrops. If a monolith matches a distant source, transport becomes part of the story. If it matches a nearby ridge, quarrying and shaping become the focus. Stone sourcing can also reveal choices that were not strictly practical. Builders sometimes bypass closer rock for stone with a particular colour, hardness, or symbolic association. A glittering quartz vein catches light differently than dull basalt, and that visual effect can matter. Some stones ring when struck, producing a bell-like tone that invites ritual use. When we identify a source, we also identify a landscape of decisions. Toolmark analysis reads the scars of work left on stone and soil, and it turns rough surfaces into evidence. Pecking, grinding, and polishing leave distinctive patterns. Metal tools can leave different signatures than stone hammers, and repeated blows create characteristic pits and ridges. Even when marks are weathered, repeated measurement can reveal a consistent technique. These details can narrow the range of plausible technologies. Toolmarks also tell us about labour and time. A surface that is fully dressed suggests sustained effort, while a rough face suggests speed or invisibility in the final design. A joint that fits tightly implies careful testing, adjustment, and patience. In some cases, the most informative marks are in hidden places, under lintels, behind walls, or at the base of sockets. The monument hides its own construction notes. Experimental archaeology tests whether proposed methods can actually work, and it forces ideas into the physical world. Researchers move stones with sledges, rollers, ropes, and levers. They replicate quarrying with stone mauls and simple wedges, including wooden wedges that swell when soaked. They measure how many people are needed, how long tasks take, and what breaks first. Experiments do not prove what happened, but they show what could have happened. These experiments also expose the difference between possibility and plausibility. A method might work once on flat ground, yet fail on steep slopes or muddy soil. A rope might hold in dry weather, yet snap when wet fibers weaken. Small changes in friction can double the labor required, and small changes in terrain can force entirely new strategies. The past was not a laboratory, and constraints mattered. Landscape archaeology widens the frame beyond the monument itself, because placement is rarely random. It studies where structures sit in relation to water, soil, and movement corridors. Viewshed analysis asks what can be seen from a site and what the site can see. Alignment studies test whether stones point to solstices, lunar extremes, or prominent peaks. Route network analysis considers how people and materials likely travelled across terrain. A landscape approach also asks how a site feels when approached on foot. A ridge can hide a stone until the last moment, creating a reveal. A valley can funnel sound, turning a gathering into an acoustic event. A monument near a spring may link ceremony to water, while a monument on thin soil may signal a choice beyond farming. These are measurable questions, even when the answers remain interpretive. These methods create a disciplined way to handle wonder, and they keep curiosity from becoming credulity. They also reveal a recurring problem. Many sites are physically well documented but culturally under-documented. We can measure volumes and angles, yet we cannot always name the builders. We can map quarries and pathways, yet we cannot read the rituals that motivated the work. This is the missing middle of deep history, where evidence survives unevenly. Some societies left no durable writing, or left symbols we cannot decode. Others wrote on materials that decayed, or wrote in archives that burned. Even when texts exist, they often describe kings and wars, not quarry crews and survey lines. The result is a gap between engineering traces and human intention. That gap has a history of its own, shaped by early archaeology and its biases. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, monuments were sometimes collected like trophies, detached from their layers. Excavations were occasionally rushed, and records were incomplete by modern standards. Later researchers have had to rebuild context from old notes, museum labels, and scattered finds. The silence is sometimes ancient, and sometimes made worse by modern loss. In that gap, speculation rushes in, and the documentary sets boundaries. We will not treat absence of evidence as evidence of impossibility. We will not treat a surprising feat as proof of lost super technology. We will treat each site as a problem with multiple working hypotheses. We will ask what evidence would support each hypothesis and what evidence would weaken it. For every monument, several explanations compete, and each has testable predictions. Ritual use might predict offerings, burials, or repeated pathways worn into the ground. Territorial marking might predict boundary placement, visibility to neighbouring groups, and patterns of spacing. Astronomical calendrics might predict consistent alignments across multiple stones and repeated orientation choices. Elite display might predict labour concentration, prestige goods, and proximity to power centres. Quarry logistics might predict tool debris, staging areas, and transport scars like trackways or prepared ramps. Seismic or engineering choices might predict specific foundation designs, drainage features, and stone selection tuned to stability. Some sites may combine several motives, because human projects rarely have one purpose. We will also track what counts as a strong claim, because certainty has to be earned. A single alignment can be coincidence, but a repeated pattern across a region is harder to dismiss. A radiocarbon date is only as good as its context, and disturbed layers can mislead. A dramatic story is not a substitute for a measured plan, a clear stratigraphic section, and replicable sampling. Mystery is a starting condition, not a conclusion. The series follows 4 focal regions that appear unrelated on a map, yet rhyme in stone. Belgium holds quiet standing stones and megalithic traces inside an intensely modern landscape. Chile offers stonework and anomalies shaped by mountains, deserts and long-distance horizons. Lebanon carries the weight of massive blocks and terraces, where quarrying and monumentality collide. Turkey preserves dense layers of settlement and monumental building, where deep time sits beneath active towns. Together, these places form one narrative about ancestors and unanswered questions. Each region has stones that can be measured, dated and sourced. Each region also has gaps in the record that refuse to close. The same impossible question rises from the ground in different languages. How did people move, shape, and align heavy stones, and why did they choose those exact places? The prologue is an invitation to listen without inventing voices, even when the silence feels provocative. Silent stones do not speak, but they do constrain what we can claim. They tell us that planning happened, that labour was organised, and that knowledge was transmitted. They do not tell us whether the goal was prayer, politics, or memory. They do not tell us which stories were told at the moment of completion. So we watch for the smallest human traces that survive alongside the larger stones. We look for hearths that fed workers, for post holes that held scaffolds, and for pits where tools were repaired. We look for patterns of breakage that suggest deliberate dismantling, not simple decay. We look for later reuse, because later people often inherit monuments and rewrite them. The stone is old, but its biography can be layered. Our method is to move from the broad to the specific, and from the measurable to the interpretive. First we establish what is physically present and what is securely dated. Then we test transport and construction scenarios against terrain and materials. Then we compare competing purposes against the wider landscape and the archaeological context. Finally, we state what remains unexplained and why it remains unresolved. This approach does not drain the mystery. It gives the mystery edges, so it can be studied rather than consumed. It also honours the people behind the stones by refusing to reduce them to caricatures. They were neither helpless primitives nor magical engineers. They were communities making choices under constraints we can partially reconstruct. Now the journey narrows to its first ground truth. Belgium is dense with roads, farms and cities, yet older stones still persist at the margins. Some stand alone, some are broken, and some may be missing entirely. Their survival raises questions about continuity, destruction, and selective memory. In a landscape rewritten by centuries, what has been forgotten in plain sight? Here the camera glides over hedgerows and field boundaries, then finds a solitary stone near a ditch. Traffic hums in the distance, and a train line flashes briefly through trees. The stone's surface is mottled with lichen, its base sunk into compacted earth. It does not dominate the horizon, yet it refuses to disappear. It is an artifact of endurance in a place built for change. Belgium's modern density makes the archaeological problem sharper, not easier. Construction, ploughing and quarrying can erase subtle traces, and older finds can be displaced. A monolith might have been moved a few metres or a few kilometres in a later century. A stone circle might survive only as a scatter of boulders in a field corner. When the landscape is busy, the past can be both everywhere and hard to see. We begin there, where the modern world presses closest to the ancient one. We begin with standing stones that refuse to explain themselves, even as they endure. The first case study asks a simple question that will echo across continents. What happened here, and what evidence would let us say so? From this point, the prologue ends and the investigation starts. Belgium waits, quiet and altered, with stones that still keep their distance. We step closer, not to solve everything, but to learn what the silence contains. And as we measure, map, and test, another question lingers. What would it take for a stone to become a memory again? Belgium wakes under low mist, and the fields look temporarily unclaimed, as if the day has not yet decided who owns it. Farm tracks cut through wet grass, and puddles hold pale reflections of a sky still half asleep. A single stone stands apart near a hedgerow, dark with moisture and streaked with lichen. It reads like punctuation in a sentence we no longer understand, an emphatic mark without the words around it. The central question returns in a quieter register, carried by the hush of morning traffic in the far distance. What do these surviving stones reveal, and what crucial pieces are still missing? In northwest Europe, stone monuments were never isolated achievements, and they rarely belonged to a single moment. They sat inside traditions that spread and adapted across coasts, river valleys, and uplands, moving with people, marriages, and exchange networks. Late Neolithic and Bronze Age communities built with stone and earth then returned to those places for generations, sometimes for centuries. The monuments anchored memory, territory, and obligation in landscapes without written borders, where authority had to be performed and re-performed. That wider context matters, because Belgium sits inside the same broad world as Brittany, southern Britain, the Netherlands, and the Rhineland. Ideas travelled along waterways that acted like prehistoric roads, and along ridgelines that offered dry passage through wet ground. Stone building was not a single culture, so much as a shared vocabulary, and each region spoke it differently. When we look at a Belgian stone today, we are seeing a local accent in a continental conversation. Belgium is not famous for megaliths in the way Brittany or Britain is, and that absence is part of the story. It is not a dismissal of the evidence, but a clue about survival, land use, and historical pressure. The country's density compresses time, and it rewards reuse over preservation, because stone is both valuable and close at hand. A standing stone can survive for millennia, then vanish in a single season of clearing, broken into manageable blocks and dragged away. We start with what remains visible, because visibility is already a filter. Isolated menhirs, low dolmens, and disturbed chambered tombs appear in pockets near the Ardennes and adjacent cultural zones, where geology provides workable stone. Some clusters sit near ridgelines and forest edges, where ploughs and roads arrived later and the ground stayed comparatively undisturbed. Others are known only through names on old maps, or through stones embedded in later walls, their original shapes trimmed to fit new purposes. When the mist lifts, the landscape reveals how little space is truly empty here. Fields are stitched with fences, drainage ditches and narrow lanes, and villages sit close enough that church towers often share the horizon. In such a landscape, even a single upright stone feels improbable, like a survivor from a different physics. Its surface carries small fractures from freeze and thaw, and its edges are softened by centuries of rain. The stone is not dramatic in the way a great circle of pillars is dramatic, yet its loneliness makes it more unsettling. Survival becomes the first mystery. Why do a few monuments endure while others are dismantled into churches, bridges and field boundaries, leaving only rumours behind? Stone is durable, but it is also convenient, and convenience is a powerful historical force. In a farming landscape, a slab is a resource before it is a relic, and a boulder is an obstacle until it becomes a foundation. The chapter follows a simple investigative rhythm, because the evidence demands discipline. First we observe the stones that still stand, and the settings that protect them, including the subtle protections of inconvenience and neglect. Then we reconstruct what is missing, using traces that survive in documents and dirt, and by comparing patterns across the region. Finally, we test the strongest explanations, and we name the gaps that remain, because uncertainty is part of the honest record. Prehistoric Northwest Europe built monuments at scales that imply planning beyond households, even when the architecture looks simple. Communal labour is not a romantic idea here, but a practical requirement, and the physics is unforgiving. A capstone does not move itself, and a socket does not dig itself, especially in compacted soils or stony ground. The work implies coordination, scheduling, and food supply, even without kings or written administration, because bodies must be fed before stones can be raised. These building traditions also imply emerging social complexity, though not necessarily centralized power. Some groups could mobilize labor repeatedly and could justify that labor through shared belief, shared ancestors, or shared obligations. Monuments can be tombs, but they are also public statements, visible proofs of cooperation. They say that a community can claim a place and can keep returning to it, even as individual lives end. When we say Late Neolithic and Bronze Age, we are describing long spans of time, not a single mood. In much of Northwest Europe, the Late Neolithic includes the spread of farming lifeways and the intensification of exchange, including stone tools and prestige goods. The Bronze Age adds metalworking, new forms of wealth, and shifting burial practices, yet older monuments often remain important. A chambered tomb can be reused, reinterpreted, or respected as an ancestral landmark, even when new technologies reshape daily life. Belgium's megalithic heritage sits at a crossroads of cultural influence, and the crossroads is not only geographic, The Ardennes and nearby regions connect to broader Atlantic and continental traditions, where similar tomb forms appear with local variations. Dolmens and passage graves echo forms seen elsewhere, but local geology and local choices shape the details, including stone size and construction style. Standing stones appear as markers, memorials, or fragments of larger ceremonial layouts, and their isolation today may be an illusion created by loss. Archaeology in Belgium often begins with partial survival, and that partiality is a constant constraint. A chamber may be collapsed, a mound may be ploughed flat, and only one orthostat may remain upright, leaning slightly as if tired. The task is to treat fragments as evidence of a former whole, without forcing them into a predetermined story. That requires careful distinction between what nature placed and what people set, because the landscape has its own long memory. Researchers start with the ground, because the ground remembers in layers even when the surface forgets. A placed stone usually leaves a socket, and the socket has diagnostic features that are hard to fake by accident. The base pit can show cut edges, packing stones, and deliberate backfill, arranged to lock the base and resist movement. Soil compaction around the base can differ from undisturbed sediment, and it can preserve a construction signature, like a fingerprint pressed into earth. In a careful excavation, the visual language becomes precise. The darker fill of a cut pit contrasts with the lighter natural subsoil, and the boundary between them can be sharp. Packing stones may be wedged at angles that make structural sense, and they often differ in size from the surrounding gravel. Sometimes the builders use layered backfill, alternating soil and stones to reduce settling, a practical solution that also reveals planning. Natural erratics complicate the picture, because glacial action brought boulders into many landscapes, and not every boulder is a monument. Ice sheets and meltwater deposited stones in positions that can look purposeful, especially when later erosion exposes them. Archaeologists look for human patterning that geology does not produce, and they do it with skepticism. Orientation, spacing, and repeated placement choices can separate intention from accident, but only when the pattern is strong. This is where measurement becomes a form of humility. A stone that looks aligned may be aligned only because the human eye loves lines, and because the landscape offers many possible targets. Researchers record azimuths, slopes, and horizon profiles, and they compare them against what random placement would generate. The goal is not to drain the mystery, but to prevent the mystery from becoming a projection. Artifacts can help, but they are not guaranteed, and their absence is common in disturbed sites. Pottery sherds, flint tools, and small offerings sometimes appear in construction layers or nearby pits, especially where monuments were used repeatedly. In other cases, the monument stands alone in sterile soil, as if it was kept clean by design or by chance. The absence of artifacts does not prove natural origin, but it weakens confident claims, and it forces caution. When artifacts do appear, context is everything. A flint blade in the backfill of a socket suggests a moment of construction, but it could also be residual material from earlier activity. Pottery fragments can be dated typologically, yet typology is a broad tool and styles overlap across time. The most persuasive evidence comes when multiple lines converge: construction cuts, packing stones, and datable material locked into the same event. Dating is the next constraint, and it is often the hardest because stone itself cannot be radiocarbon dated. Many Belgian sites lack preserved organic material, especially where acidic soils dissolve bone and where repeated disturbance removes fragile layers. When charcoal survives in a secure construction layer, radiocarbon can bracket building or reuse, offering a window into the monument's life. When it does not, researchers turn to other clocks, each with its own assumptions. Radiocarbon dating works by measuring the decay of carbon-14 in once-living material, but it only dates the organism's death, not the human action directly. Charcoal from a construction layer may reflect a fire used during building, or it may be older material redeposited by chance. The old wood problem matters because a long-lived tree can die centuries before its charcoal ends up in a pit. For that reason, short-lived samples like twigs or seeds are prized when they survive. Optically stimulated luminescence can date sediments in stone sockets, and it is especially valuable when bones and charcoal are absent. If the socket fill was last exposed to sunlight during construction, OSL can estimate when it was buried, because mineral grains store energy from natural radiation over time. In the lab, that stored energy is released as light, and the intensity helps calculate elapsed time. The method demands careful sampling and strict control of light exposure, because a few seconds of daylight can reset the clock. OSL is powerful, but it is not magic, and it comes with its own uncertainties. The sediment must have been sufficiently bleached by sunlight before burial, otherwise the date can appear too old. Disturbance can mix grains of different ages, especially in ploughed landscapes, and that can blur the signal. Yet when sampling is careful and the stratigraphy is clear, OSL offers a path forward, turning ordinary soil into a time marker. Even good dates can be ambiguous, because monuments have long lives and many hands. A socket may be cleaned and reused, and later disturbance can mix sediments, producing a date that reflects repair rather than construction. Charcoal can be older than the event that burned it, and a later fire can scatter younger charcoal into older layers. The best practice is convergence across methods and contexts, not reliance on a single number, because a single number can seduce. Belgium's losses force archaeology to work with indirect evidence, and indirect evidence becomes a kind of detective literature. Old cadastral maps can record stones that no longer exist, marking them as obstacles, boundaries, or curiosities. Parish histories and early antiquarian notes can preserve locations, even when descriptions are imprecise and coordinates are absent. Place names can hint at former monuments, though names can drift over time, and a stone field may outlive the stone. A map is never neutral, and that is part of its value. When a surveyor marks a stone, it is often because it matters to property, to taxation, or to navigation. Those practical motives can preserve traces of ancient features long after their meaning is forgotten. Comparing editions of maps across decades can show when a stone disappears, narrowing the window of destruction to a human timescale. Local folklore becomes a parallel archive, carried by repetition rather than ink. Stories of devil stones, dancing stones, and stones that move at night often cluster around real features, because striking objects attract narrative. Folklore can preserve a site's importance while losing its original mechanism, like a melody kept after the lyrics change. It can also invent meaning where a stone was simply conspicuous, because humans dislike silent landmarks. The chapter treats folklore as data with limits, and the limits are part of the method. A repeated motif across villages can signal long memory of a place, or it can signal a popular story that spread later. A story tied to a specific stone can help locate a destroyed monument, especially when it includes a route description or a nearby spring. Folklore cannot date a structure, and it cannot replace excavation, but it can guide questions, and sometimes it guides spades. Reused stones create another kind of archive, one built into the fabric of later life. Megalithic slabs can be found in church foundations, farm walls, and roadbeds, where they sit hidden behind plaster or beneath asphalt. Tool marks can be obscured by weathering or recutting, but stone type and shape can still be diagnostic, especially when a slab is unusually large. A capstone reused as a threshold carries a hidden biography, and every footstep across it becomes an unknowing contact with deep time. In some villages, the reuse is almost intimate. A stone that once framed a burial chamber may now support a stable wall, warmed by animals and darkened by soot. A menhir may be broken and stacked into a field boundary, its vertical ambition reduced to a line. These transformations are not only destruction, but translation, and they show how the past is absorbed into the present. Archaeologists sometimes trace these biographies through petrography and sourcing, because stone has a geological signature. If a slab in a wall matches a known megalithic stone type, it may be a displaced monument element, especially if the nearest outcrop is far away. If it matches a local outcrop, it may be ordinary building stone chosen for convenience rather than ancestry. The distinction is careful, and it is rarely dramatic, but it can shift a site from legend to plausible reconstruction. Material sourcing also reopens the construction question, because the choice of stone is a choice of labour. Some Belgian monuments use glacial erratics, which were already detached and available, scattered like gifts from an older climate. Others use quarried blocks, which imply extraction, shaping and transport, and therefore more planning. Each choice reflects different constraints and different intentions, and it hints at what a community considered worth the effort. Quarrying itself is a kind of engineering, even without metal tools. Stone can be split using wedges of wood that swell when wet, or by exploiting natural fractures and bedding planes. Hammerstones can peck and shape edges, and repeated impacts can create surprisingly regular surfaces. The work is slow, but it is predictable, and predictability is what makes collective labour possible. Transport is where the impossible question becomes practical, and where imagination must stay tethered to physics. How did communities move multi-ton stones without machines, and without leaving clear records that survive to our time? The likely answers are simple tools used with skill, combined with social organisation that keeps many people pulling together. Levers, ropes, sledges, rollers, and prepared tracks can multiply human force, and they can turn weight into a manageable problem. Winter hauling is a plausible hypothesis in some settings, and it fits the realities of seasonal labour. Frozen ground reduces friction, and snow can act as a lubricant under sled runners, especially when packed and watered into ice. Waterlogged soils can also be used strategically, if routes are chosen carefully, and if the ground can bear the load. Experimental archaeology in Europe shows that coordinated teams can move heavy stones with basic technology, but only when rhythm and leadership hold. Those experiments are revealing because they expose the hidden variables. A small change in slope can double the effort, and a single rut can trap a sledge and break momentum. The best results come when teams use steady cadence, with calls that synchronize pulling and resting. In that sense, engineering is also performance, and performance is also social glue. Experiments do not prove a specific Belgian method, but they narrow the range of what is plausible. They show what breaks first, and what labour numbers are realistic, and how fatigue becomes a limiting factor. They show how terrain changes everything, and why route planning matters more than raw strength. They also show that engineering knowledge can be embedded in practice, not in writing, passed hand to hand. Once a stone arrives, setting it upright becomes a second problem, and it is often more delicate than hauling. A socket must be deep enough to resist tipping and frost heave, and the builders had to understand their soil. Packing stones and layered backfill can lock the base in place, acting like a wedge system that distributes pressure. The builders had to anticipate settling, and had to accept that adjustment might be necessary, because perfect stability is rare. The moment of raising a stone is easy to romanticize, yet it is also a technical sequence. A pit is dug with sloped sides, the stone is levered in, and ropes control the fall into position. Earth and packing stones are added in stages, and each stage is tamped down to remove voids. The final upright stance is not an instant, but a negotiated equilibrium between weight and ground. These technical choices connect to social choices, because monuments are not only built, but maintained, revisited, and sometimes altered. Some passage graves show evidence of reopening and additional depositions, suggesting long-term relationships with the dead. Some standing stones show signs of a later damage or deliberate toppling, which can be interpreted as conflict, conversion, or changing values. A monument can be a living place before it becomes a ruin, and its life history can be complex. Placement in the landscape is where mystery intensifies, because placement is never purely practical. Many stones sit near ridges, watersheds, and route corridors, where movement is channeled and views open outward. Some stand near springs or wet ground where water and boundary meet, and where the land feels charged even today. Others occupy liminal spaces between arable land and forest, where movement and visibility intersect, and where a marker can speak to multiple groups. The visuals here are subtle but persuasive. A ridge crest offers a thin line of sky, and a stone on that line becomes a silhouette, readable from far away. A valley approach hides the stone until the last rise, creating a staged reveal that feels intentional. In a land of gentle gradients, small changes in elevation matter, and a builder's eye would have noticed what a modern driver misses. Do these placements mark practical routes, or ritual pathways, or both depending on the season? Do they define gathering grounds, or signal rights to resources like pasture, timber, or water? Do they encode seasonal timing, or simply use prominent ground because prominence is persuasive? The chapter holds these as competing hypotheses, not simultaneous certainties, because certainty is expensive and the evidence is thin. Archaeoastronomy enters cautiously, because alignments are easy to claim and hard to prove, especially with isolated stones. A single stone pointing toward a sunrise can be coincidence in a world with many horizons and many possible dates. A meaningful claim requires patterns across multiple sites, consistent orientation choices, and statistical testing against random distributions. It also requires attention to changing horizons, vegetation, and precession over millennia, because the sky itself shifts slowly. When a passage grave is oriented, the orientation may reflect sunrise at a particular time of year, but it may also reflect topography and access. Builders might align an entrance toward a valley route, toward a water source, or toward the most stable ground for construction. The challenge is to separate intentional celestial targeting from practical landscape logic, and sometimes the answer is that both mattered. A society can build for the sky and the soil at the same time. Some Belgian stones and tombs invite these questions through their orientation, even in fragmentary form. Passage graves can align towards certain sunrise points, and standing stones can form sightlines with distant hills or notches. Yet the record is patchy, and many sites are disturbed or incomplete, which makes pattern detection difficult. The chapter emphasizes how uncertainty grows when the dataset is small, because small datasets encourage overinterpretation. Landscape placement can also be read through visibility and movement, and these are measurable properties. A stone that appears only at the last bend can stage a controlled approach, suggesting procession or deliberate encounter. A stone visible from multiple valleys can act as a shared reference point, a landmark that compresses space into a common map. These properties can be modelled with viewshed analysis, even when meaning remains debated and cannot be excavated. The human dimension keeps the investigation grounded, because stones are not the only actors here. The builders were engineers in the practical sense, and storytellers in the social sense, and those roles reinforce each other. They could transmit technique through apprenticeship, and transmit meaning through ceremony, song, and repeated gathering. Oral tradition can preserve purpose while losing method, or preserve method while purpose shifts, and both outcomes leave traces. That dual transmission matters for interpretation, because continuity is rarely simple. A community might remember that a stone is a meeting place, but forget why it was first raised, turning origin into myth. Another community might remember how to set stones, but apply the skill to new symbols, perhaps to mark new boundaries or new alliances. Continuity can exist without stable meaning, and meaning can persist without stable details, like a ritual performed with altered explanations. Belgium's modern history adds pressure to every inference, because the landscape has been intensively worked and repeatedly reorganized. Industrial extraction has removed stone from hillsides and riverbeds, and quarries have eaten into ridges that once offered stable ground. Agricultural clearing has flattened mounds and scattered orthostats, and mechanized ploughing can erase subtle earthworks in a few decades. Road building has cut through ridges, and drainage has altered wetland margins that once structured movement, changing the very logic of routes. Wartime damage adds another layer of loss, and it is not only the obvious craters. Trenches, shelling, and rapid construction can destroy subtle sites without recording them, especially when survival is the priority. Post-war rebuilding can reuse stone again, and can erase the last surface traces, replacing uneven ground with leveled fields. In a crowded landscape, the past is not only buried, but repeatedly rearranged, and rearrangement is its own kind of violence. This creates an archaeological negative space, where absence becomes a form of evidence. Missing monuments become part of the record, because their absence is patterned and often explainable. If old maps show stones near a route that is now a highway, destruction becomes a likely explanation, and the timing can sometimes be narrowed. If folklore clusters around a field with no stones, removal becomes a hypothesis worth testing, and the field becomes a question mark. Negative space also changes the emotional tone of the investigation, because it forces us to imagine what is no longer there. The mystery is not only what the stones meant, but how many were lost, and how quietly they disappeared. The surviving stones may be statistical survivors, not representative examples, preserved by chance rather than importance. What we see today may be only a fraction of what once structured the region, and that fraction can mislead. The chapter returns to the survival question with sharper edges, because survival is not neutral. Some stones endure because they were inconvenient to remove, too heavy, too awkward, or too embedded in wet ground. Some endure because later communities protected them, whether for superstition, identity, or simple respect for the old. Some endure because they were forgotten in marginal land, then rediscovered, and rediscovery can feel like revelation. Protection can be accidental or deliberate, and both leave similar outcomes. A stone in a hedgerow can survive because it marks a boundary that remains useful, and usefulness is a powerful shield. A stone near a chapel can survive because it becomes part of local identity, reinterpreted rather than erased. A stone in a forest can survive because industrial agriculture never reached it, and because trees discourage the kind of clearing that destroys monuments. Yet survival can also distort understanding, and the chapter insists on that discomfort. A monument preserved in a forest may not reflect the original distribution of monuments in open land, because forests are often the leftovers of land use. A stone spared because it became a boundary marker may have been moved from its original setting, and movement can create false alignments. The chapter treats every surviving stone as both evidence and bias, a clue and a complication. We narrow to the methods that can still recover lost context, because context is what turns a stone into a monument. Field survey can detect low mounds, stone scatters, and soil discoloration, especially under low sun when shadows reveal microtopography. Geophysics can reveal pits, ditches, and buried chambers without excavation, using magnetometry and ground-penetrating radar to read differences in soil and stone. Small targeted trenches can confirm sockets, packing stones, and construction layers, turning anomalies into interpretable features. Each method has limits in Belgium's conditions, and the limits shape what can be known. Ploughing can smear features, and modern debris can confuse signals, especially near roads and farm buildings. Tree roots and drainage can distort stratigraphy, and burrowing animals can move small artifacts across layers. Excavation is slow and destructive by nature, so it must be justified by clear questions, because the act of learning can also erase. The investigative tension comes from that constraint, and it gives the chapter its careful pace. The stones demand answers, but the ground offers only partial pages, torn and overwritten. Every test risks destroying what it seeks to read, especially when features are shallow and fragile. The chapter emphasizes careful sampling, clear documentation, and hypotheses that can be revised, because revision is a sign of strength, not failure. As evidence accumulates, a plausible picture forms without becoming complete, and that incompleteness is honest. Communities in the late Neolithic and Bronze Age raised stones and built chambers to anchor memory and to make claims visible. They used available boulders and quarried slabs, and they solved transport with coordinated labour and practiced technique. They placed monuments where visibility, movement, and symbolism overlapped, choosing sites that could hold attention across generations. What remains unexplained is the precise grammar of those choices, the rules that were obvious to builders and opaque to us. Why one ridge and not the next ridge, when both offer similar views and similar stone? Why one orientation repeated, while another was ignored, and whether repetition reflects belief or habit? Why some sites cluster tightly, while others stand alone, and whether isolation was the point? These are questions of social meaning, and meaning rarely fossilizes, because it lives in minds. Belgium stones also challenge the idea that mystery requires remoteness, because here the unknown survives beside roads and towns. The landscape is mapped, owned, and managed, yet deep time still leaves gaps that modern systems cannot close. A commuter can pass within meters of a prehistoric marker without knowing it, and that ignorance is not stupidity, but a symptom of layered history. The chapter frames that as a warning for the series, because modern knowledge does not guarantee ancient clarity. We end where we began, with a solitary stone in a reshaped field, now fully visible under a thinning sky. It is heavy, weathered, and stubbornly specific in its placement, as if it insists on being counted. It survived not because it explains itself, but because it resisted removal, whether by weight or by chance. Its silence is not empty, because silence can be information when the world around it has been stripped away. It is a record of labour, loss, and selective memory, pressed into the landscape. The central question holds steady as the chapter closes, refusing easy resolution. What do these standing stones reveal about ancient communities, and what crucial pieces are still missing? Belgium offers an answer made of fragments, where ingenuity is visible and intention is partly hidden. The stones do not solve the past, but they keep it open, and they invite us to Even the air becomes part of the story at altitude because physiology sets limits on labour. Above roughly 2,500 metres, oxygen pressure drops enough to slow sustained exertion for newcomers, while long-term residents show adaptations that still do not erase risk. Lower oxygen reduces aerobic capacity, so hauling stones or clearing ground becomes a slower, more deliberate rhythm. Cold nights can freeze water skins, and sudden storms can turn a pass into a trap. If people repeatedly built in these zones, they were not wandering randomly. They were planning around thresholds that modern visitors feel immediately. Chile's past is not one culture, but a mosaic of interacting communities that shifted through time. Along the Andes and across the desert margins, groups developed local traditions while remaining connected to wider networks. Trade corridors linked valleys, oases, and high passes, moving salt, metals, shells, dyes, and camelid products. Caravans of llamas turned sparse terrain into travel terrain, even when permanent settlement was thin and the horizon looked empty. Llamas are adapted to thin air and cold nights, and their steady pace sets a natural cadence for long-distance exchange. Routes were not only economic because exchange carried marriage ties, ritual obligations, and political influence, moving ideas as efficiently as goods. In this setting, a mark on the ground can be both practical and symbolic, and those roles can overlap without contradiction. A traveller may read a figure as a sign of direction, while a local group reads the same figure as a statement of identity. A corridor can be a marketplace in motion and a ceremonial pathway at the same time. The desert does not separate these categories cleanly, and that ambiguity is part of what makes the anomalies compelling. The chapter uses a case study framework rather than a single famous site, because the pattern is the point. We follow categories of anomalies that repeat across Chile's extremes, sometimes separated by hundreds of kilometres, yet shaped by similar constraints. Large-scale ground designs appear on slopes and pampas, built by clearing darker stones to reveal lighter soil beneath. Remote stone enclosures sit on ridgelines and plateaus, often without obvious domestic debris and sometimes far from modern roads. Unusual cairn fields spread across barren ground, where stacking seems excessive for simple trail marking, especially when the stones are heavy and the air is thin. Coastal and valley ruins complicate the picture, because they sit closer to resources yet still resist easy purpose. Some structures look like practical shelters, while others suggest planned compounds that required more coordination. In places, dunes press against walls like slow waves, and salt haze blurs the line between land and sea. The same country holds both the driest desert and a long marine edge, and each setting preserves a different kind of question. Each category raises the same central question in a new register. What do these anomalies reveal about ancient societies, and what crucial pieces are still missing from the record? The evidence is measurable, but the motives are not directly preserved, and that gap invites both careful inference and careless fantasy. The task is to test competing explanations without filling gaps with spectacle, because spectacle is easy and verification is hard. We begin with geoglyph traditions, because scale forces the issue of intention and coordination. Some figures are geometric, others depict animals or human forms, and many are visible from ridgelines where a traveller's eye naturally scans. Their placement is rarely random, because they cluster near routes, passes and vantage points where movement concentrates. In the clearest light, lines and silhouettes appear to float on the slope, as if the hillside itself is a signal. Yet clustering alone does not decide whether they guided travel or staged ritual, because the same corridor can carry commerce, pilgrimage, and diplomacy. The construction method is deceptively simple, and that simplicity can hide its cost. Builders often cleared dark desert stones from the surface, exposing lighter sediments that create contrast when seen from above or across a slope. In other cases, they piled stones along edges to sharpen lines, creating borders that resist wind redistribution. The labour is not just the first act of making, but the repeated act of keeping the figure legible. Because in a windy landscape, edges soften unless someone returns. Remote sensing changes what can be seen, because many designs are too large for ground perception and too dispersed for a single survey team. Satellite imagery and aerial photography reveal outlines, superpositions and regional patterning that the human eye cannot assemble from the surface. When a drone climbs, the figure snaps into coherence, and the desert becomes a canvas rather than a scatter of stones. GIS mapping records location, elevation, slope, aspect, and proximity to water and known paths, turning visual impressions into variables that can be tested. Researchers digitize figures, classify motifs, and compare distributions across valleys and plateaus, looking for repeated choices. Do camelid figures cluster near known caravan corridors, while geometric forms cluster near passes? Do certain motifs appear in zones with better pasture, suggesting seasonal aggregation? They also look for superposition, where one design cuts across another, because overlap can imply sequence and changing priorities. The goal is not only to catalogue, but to generate testable predictions about why placement matters and to expose patterns that anecdotes miss. Photogrammetry adds detail where access is possible, turning overlapping photos into accurate 3D surfaces that preserve micro-relief. With enough images and careful calibration, software reconstructs a surface model that can be measured down to centimeters. Subtle berms, tread marks, and stone piles emerge in the model, even when they are hard to notice on foot. LiDAR is used selectively because vegetation is sparse in the desert, but can matter in valleys where shrubs and grasses obscure low walls. High-resolution models show construction technique, including cleared lines, piled borders, and repair episodes that suggest maintenance rather than a single burst of activity. Microtopography can reveal whether a figure was made once or maintained repeatedly, and that distinction matters for interpretation. A freshly cleared line tends to have crisp edges and consistent depth, while a maintained line can show reworking, infill removal, and small piles where stones were restacked. Maintenance implies ongoing meaning, not a one-time gesture. An ongoing meaning implies social memory that had to be taught. Who taught it, and to whom, becomes an archaeological question even when the teachers are long gone. Soil chemistry and microstratigraphy test the invisible side of these works, where the ground keeps traces too small to see. Repeated human presence can leave compacted surfaces, ash lenses, and microlayers of trampled sediment that accumulate slowly. Chemical signatures can indicate burning, food processing, or dung from caravan animals, even when no obvious hearth remains. Phosphate enrichment can suggest organic waste, while microscopic charcoal can signal repeated small fires rather than one dramatic event. Even in a clean desert, tiny traces can accumulate where people stop often, and those traces can be mapped like a faint halo. The ground becomes a ledger of return visits, even when artifacts are scarce and wind has scattered the obvious debris. A place that looks empty to a camera can still be chemically crowded with past activity. This is one reason archaeologists resist quick conclusions based only on surface impressions. Dating remains a constraint, because stone and scraped soil do not carry carbon, and the desert preserves without labeling. Researchers date associated hearths, charcoal flecks, and organic inclusions trapped in construction layers, but each association must be demonstrated. Radiocarbon ranges bracket episodes of activity, but context must be secure to matter, and secure context is hard in open-air settings. A hearth near a figure might be contemporary, or it might be later reuse of a convenient stopping place that happened to be sheltered. Multiple samples and clear stratigraphy are required to avoid a seductive but weak timeline, especially when a single date can look authoritative on screen. Calibration curves can widen uncertainties, and old wood effects can mislead if fuel was collected from long-dead shrubs. Even the act of sampling can disturb fragile contexts, so teams often combine minimal excavation with extensive documentation. The result is a chronology built from brackets and probabilities, not a neat list of years. Paleo-environmental proxies widen the frame beyond the figure itself, because climate shapes the feasibility of movement. Lake cores, pollen records, and sediment chemistry track moisture shifts over centuries, sometimes revealing pulses of wetter conditions in otherwise dry sequences. In the high Andes, ice cores and glacial histories can also speak to precipitation and temperature trends. Climate changes alter route viability, pasture availability, and the location of reliable water, which in turn affects where caravans can travel and where they must stop. If construction peaks align with wetter phases, increased traffic becomes plausible, because more water supports more animals and more movement. If construction aligns with drought stress, signaling and ritual coordination become plausible, because scarcity can intensify the need for cooperation and shared rules. The environment becomes a variable, not a backdrop, and the desert becomes a record of both human choices and climatic pressure. The question becomes not only what people built, but what conditions made building worth the cost. Competing hypotheses for ground figures must be treated as models with predictions, not as stories with convenient endings. Route markers predict proximity to path networks, visibility to travellers, and clustering near decision points like forks and passes. Ritual landscapes predict repeated activity areas, offerings, and patterned clustering near sacred features, including distinctive hills or springs. Territorial signalling predicts boundary placement and visibility toward neighbouring zones, especially where resources are contested. Astronomical or seasonal indicators predict consistent orientations to solstices, lunar extremes, or horizon notches, but those predictions must be tested statistically. A few alignments can happen by chance in a landscape full of ridges, so researchers look for repeated non-random patterns across many figures. They also ask whether the viewing position is plausible, because an alignment that requires standing in an inaccessible spot is less convincing. The sky can be part of meaning, but it must leave a pattern strong enough to separate from coincidence. Visibility studies test these ideas with measurable geometry, turning intuition into numbers. Viewshed analysis models what can be seen from ridgelines and what can see the figure, accounting for terrain and sometimes for Earth curvature at long distances. If a figure is visible mainly from a route corridor, guidance becomes more plausible, because it meets the eye where travellers actually move. If it is visible from multiple basins, broadcasting to dispersed groups becomes more plausible, because the audience expands. If visibility is limited yet the figure is elaborate, local ritual investment becomes more plausible, because the builders may have cared more about the act than the audience. The method does not prove meaning, but it narrows the range of claims and exposes weak assumptions. It also reveals a subtle point. Some figures are placed where they are hard to see, which suggests that visibility was not always the primary goal. Path modelling adds another test, because movement in harsh terrain follows constraints that can be quantified. Least-cost path analysis estimates likely travel corridors based on slope, water points, altitude penalties, and sometimes known pasture zones. Researchers compare modelled routes with known trails, caravan sites, and artefact scatters, looking for convergence rather than perfect overlap. If geoglyph clusters align with modelled corridors, the route hypothesis gains support, because the placement matches predicted movement. If clusters sit off modelled corridors, other motives must explain the labour, or the model must be revised to include factors like social boundaries and ritual detours. Models are only as good as their inputs, and water points can shift over centuries. This is why field verification matters, even in an era of powerful imagery. The desert can fool algorithms as easily as it fools the eye. Engineering questions sharpen when we consider labour in sparse environments, where every hour of work requires provisioning. Building large figures requires time, coordination, and repeated visits to maintain edges, and those visits require water and shelter. Water constraints limit how long crews can work, and where they can camp, which makes certain placements more meaningful. Even small crews need predictable resupply, so the nearest spring can matter as much as the nearest quarry. If the landscape appears empty, why invest in monumental signals there, and why return to them? The tension is between empty landscape and travelled landscape, and the evidence often favours travel, but travel with purpose. A caravan corridor can be busy for a few weeks each year, and silent the rest of the time, leaving a modern impression of abandonment. Yet seasonal movement can still sustain traditions that last centuries, because repetition is more important than constant presence. The desert's silence can hide a calendar of motion. We shift from scraped designs to stone enclosures, because stone implies different labour and different permanence, and permanence changes what a structure can do. Enclosures appear as low walls, rings, or rectilinear compounds, sometimes on high ground where wind scours the ground clean. Some sit near passes, others near water sources, and some sit in places that seem deliberately inconvenient, as if inconvenience itself was part of their function. Their silhouettes are modest from ground level, yet from above they read as deliberate geometry laid onto raw terrain. Their interiors can be sterile, or contain faint traces of hearths and broken tools that only become visible after careful screening. The question is whether they were corrals, refuges, ritual spaces, or checkpoints, and each possibility leaves different traces. Corrals should show evidence of animal penning, including dung residues and trampling patterns that compact floors. Refuges might show brief hearth use, windbreak construction, and limited artifact diversity. Ritual spaces might show offerings, unusual deposition patterns, or repeated burning in specific spots rather than general domestic scatter. Here, Microstratigraphy becomes decisive because walls alone do not reveal use, and clean floors can be misleading. Floor sediments can show repeated trampling, dung accumulation, or ash from cooking fires, even when the surface looks sterile. Soil phosphate can indicate animal penning, while charcoal and burned bones suggest human meals and processing. Artifact density and diversity help separate temporary stops from longer occupation, because longer stays tend to accumulate varied tool types and repair debris. A corral used seasonally can look empty, yet still leave chemical fingerprints that persist for centuries in arid conditions. Thin lenses of compacted sediment can form under repeated hoof action, and those lenses can be sampled like pages in a book. In some cases, microscopic plant remains can hint at fodder brought from lower elevations, which implies planning and transport. The enclosure becomes a node in a logistical system, not an isolated curiosity. Radiocarbon dating of hearths inside and outside enclosures tests whether walls were used repeatedly and whether use changed through time. If dates cluster tightly, a short episode is likely, perhaps linked to a specific event such as a surge in traffic or a period of conflict. If dates span centuries, the enclosure may have been a persistent node in a root system, maintained by successive groups who recognized its utility. Repair episodes in wall construction can indicate long-term importance, because people rarely repair what they do not value. Long-term importance raises the question of who controlled access and why, especially in landscapes where direct authority is hard to enforce. A checkpoint interpretation becomes plausible if enclosures sit at choke points and show evidence of repeated stopping. Yet control can be social rather than military, expressed through norms, alliances, and ritual obligations. The archaeology may not reveal the enforcers, but it can reveal the repeated act of compliance. People stopping, gathering, and moving on. Cairn fields push the mystery further, because stacking stones is simple, yet the scale can be startling, and the repetition feels intentional. Some cairns align along ridges, others spread across flats, and some form patterns that only emerge when viewed from above. A single cairn can be a trail marker, but hundreds demand explanation, especially when they are built from stones that had to be carried and balanced. Are they navigational aids in low-contrast terrain, or memorials for deaths on dangerous routes where loss was common? Are they territorial statements, or ritual accumulations built by repeated acts that turned motion into meaning? In some traditions, adding a stone can be a gesture of respect, a request for safe passage, or a way to mark a threshold crossed. The act is small, but the accumulation is monumental, and that contrast is itself a clue. A cairn field can be a map made of gestures. Researchers test cairn hypotheses by mapping spacing, alignment and relationship to roots and water, because pattern is evidence. If cairns form consistent intervals, navigation becomes plausible, especially in fog-prone highlands where landmarks vanish quickly. If cairns cluster at thresholds like passes, ritual deposition becomes plausible, because passes are natural points of anxiety and relief. If cairns appear near resource zones, territorial marking becomes plausible, because resources invite boundary making. Excavation is limited, but small tests can reveal whether cairns cover burials or contain offerings, and those outcomes change interpretation. A cairn that covers nothing may still be meaningful, because meaning can be placed on the surface rather than buried. A cairn that contains a token object suggests a practice repeated across travellers, creating a shared script. Even negative evidence matters, because it rules out certain claims while leaving others open. Coastal and valley ruins add another layer, because they sit closer to food and water, where settlement seems more straightforward. Some are small stone structures, others are larger compounds with walls and terraces that imply planned labour. Preservation varies, because dunes can bury quickly while storms can strip surfaces clean, exposing foundations like bones. Salt crystallization can fracture stone, while wind-driven sand can abrade edges until tool marks blur. Here, the question is not only why build, but why abandon, and abandonment is rarely a single moment. Shifts in river courses can strand fields or flood them, changing the value of a location within a generation. El Niño cycles can bring destructive rains to normally dry valleys, while also reshaping marine productivity along the coast. Resource depletion can push people to reorganize, and social conflict can accelerate that process, leaving architecture as the last visible trace of a decision. Paleo-environmental data helps connect ruins to changing coastlines and hydrology, grounding human choices in measurable change. Sediment cores can reveal flood events, drought intervals, and vegetation change, sometimes with annual laminations that act like timestamps. Shell middens can track shifts in marine species, hinting at changing ocean conditions and harvesting pressure. If abandonment aligns with increased aridity, water stress becomes a driver, and the ruins become a record of limits reached. If abandonment aligns with social disruption evidenced elsewhere, conflict and reorganization become plausible, and the ruins become a record of instability. The chapter treats environment and society as interacting pressures, not competing single causes, because people respond to climate through social systems. A drought does not force a single outcome, but it raises the cost of certain choices. Archaeology looks for how those costs were managed and where management failed. Across these cases, the investigative process stays foregrounded, because method is the bridge between mystery and explanation. First, define the feature with mapping and measurement, because description must be precise before interpretation begins. That includes dimensions, orientation, construction materials, and the relationship to surrounding microtopography. Second, establish association with routes, water, and other sites, because isolation is often an illusion created by modern travel patterns. Third, test for repeated activity using soil chemistry, microstratigraphy, and artifact patterning, because repeated use is a strong signal of function. Fourth, date securely where possible, and treat dates as brackets rather than final answers, because open landscapes can be reused. Fifth, compare hypotheses using visibility and movement models, and accept mixed motives when evidence supports them, because human behavior rarely fits a single category. This is where the series' caution against sensationalism becomes necessary, because unexplained discoveries attract claims that jump from anomaly to impossibility. In Chile, desert preservation can make features look fresh, feeding the illusion of recent or non-human origin, especially when edges remain crisp. Fringe narratives often ignore context, skip measurement, and cherry-pick alignments that feel persuasive in a single frame. Archaeology answers by demanding replicable mapping, transparent methods, and material associations that can be checked by other teams. Extraordinary assertions require ordinary evidence, repeated across independent lines, and that repetition is the real test. If a claim depends on a single photo angle, it is weak because angles can manufacture patterns. If it depends on ignoring known trade corridors and ecological constraints, it is weaker because it contradicts what we can already measure. If it cannot survive basic GIS analysis and ground verification, it fails because science is built on procedures that others can repeat. The chapter frames rigor as respect for the builders because it credits them with real capability rather than invented rescue. It also resists a subtle insult that hides inside sensationalism, the idea that ancient people could not organize labor, plan routes, or build meaning into landscapes. When we replace careful inference with spectacle, we erase the ingenuity that the evidence actually supports. The desert does not need aliens to be impressive, because human planning under constraint is already extraordinary. The human story returns through the constraints that shaped every decision, because constraints reveal priorities. Ancestors navigated harsh ecologies where a wrong turn could be fatal, and where a missed water point could end a journey. Landmarks and signals could be tools for survival, guiding caravans between water points and across featureless plains. Enclosures could protect animals and people from wind, cold, and theft, turning exposure into manageable risk. Cairns could compress shared memory into a route, turning danger into a known sequence of thresholds. Geoglyphs could bind groups together through shared labor, shared calendars, and shared identity, making cooperation visible on the ground. A figure might be a message to strangers, but it could also be a promise to insiders, renewed each time someone repaired an edge. The desert holds these possibilities in the same scraped lines. Monuments in sparse places can function as social infrastructure, and infrastructure is not only roads and walls. They can coordinate movement across distances where direct authority is hard to enforce, because shared signs reduce uncertainty. They can broadcast affiliation to travelers who never meet the builders, creating a sense of belonging that extends beyond face-to-face contact. They can mark seasonal timing when resources appear briefly, then vanish, helping groups converge and separate without chaos. They can also serve ritual needs that stabilize cooperation, because cooperation is fragile under scarcity and suspicion. If a caravan route depends on trust, then shared practices can be as important as shared wells. A cairn added by each traveller can be a small tax paid to the collective, a reminder that survival is communal. The question becomes not only what these features meant, but how meaning functioned as a technology. Isolation amplifies mystery because it preserves outcomes while erasing conversations, and that imbalance shapes our modern reaction. The desert keeps the line on the ground, but not the arguments that chose that line, and not the voices that disagreed. The plateau keeps the wall, but not the agreements that maintained it, and not the disputes that tested it. The coast keeps foundations, but not the stories that justified their building, and not the songs that made work feel shared. We are left with durable signals and incomplete captions, and the central question remains active rather than solved. What did a traveller see when they crested a ridge and recognised a figure below? What did they feel when they reached a cairn threshold and added a stone with cold fingers? What did they expect when they saw an enclosure ahead? Shelter, exchange, obligation, or warning? These questions are not decoration. They guide what evidence we seek. We close by returning to the Atacama's long horizon, where scale makes human work feel improbable and time feels stretched. The camera drifts over pampas that seem untouched, then catches a line that is too straight to be accidental. The anomalies are not proof of impossibility, but proof of planning under constraint, repeated enough times to become tradition. They show that travelled landscapes can look empty, and that emptiness can be a misleading modern perception shaped by highways and flight paths. They also show how much history can be reconstructed without writing, when methods are careful and hypotheses are testable, and when uncertainty is treated honestly. Wonder remains, but it is disciplined by measurement, because measurement protects wonder from becoming fiction. In the Atacama, the past is not hidden underground so much as spread across the surface, waiting to be read with the right tools. The desert is quiet, but it is not mute. From anomalies drawn across deserts, we move to stones stacked on a scale that seems to defy gravity. The next chapter turns to Lebanon, where trilithons and colossal blocks raise the documentary's biggest engineering riddle. The same impossible question rises again, heavier and more direct, and the search for missing pieces tightens. Twilight settles over Lebanon's Bekaa Valley, and the air cools faster than expected at this elevation. The sky fades from pale gold to bruised violet, and the plain begins to hold shadows like water. In the half-light, Baalbek rises as a layered ruin, built and rebuilt by successive powers. Its stones catch the last angled sun, then lose it, one column at a time, until the complex becomes a dark geometry against the horizon. Even before we name the site, the landscape frames it as a threshold, and that framing is not accidental. The Bekaa is a long corridor between mountain ranges, a route for caravans, armies and pilgrims moving between coasts and interiors. The valley's soils are famously fertile, fed by seasonal rains and mountain runoff, yet its winters can bite and its summers can glare. That tension, abundance and exposure helps explain why this place was contested, invested in, and repeatedly reimagined. As the light thins, you notice how the ruins sit slightly apart from the modern world around them. Low fields stretch outward, then lift toward the anti-Lebanon range, where ridgelines cut the sky into sharp layers. The wind changes direction in the evening, and it seems to comb through broken capitals and fallen drums. It is the kind of setting that makes time feel stacked, not linear. Every wall here is a palimpsest: Phoenician, Hellenistic, Roman, Byzantine, Islamic, Ottoman, modern, each phase cutting into the last. You can feel it in the masonry seams, where one style interrupts another without apology. You can see it in the reused blocks, where an older chisel finish survives on a stone turned inward. You can hear it in the quiet logic of the site itself, which keeps insisting that history is rarely a clean line. A palimpsest is usually a manuscript scraped and written over, yet the metaphor works because stone also gets revised. A doorway becomes a wall, a shrine becomes a foundation, and a column drum becomes fill. In places, the joints are so tight that they look modern, yet the surfaces show centuries of weathering. The result is a ruin that behaves like an archive, even when the pages are missing. The central question returns with new weight as the light drops and details blur. What do the world's most unexplained discoveries and megalithic structures reveal about ancient civilizations, and what crucial pieces of history are we still missing? The question is not only about technology, but about memory. about what societies choose to record and what they leave behind as mute results. Baalbek is also Heliopolis, a Roman city of temples and imperial messaging. The Latin name means City of the Sun, and it echoes older Near Eastern solar cults that likely predate Roman rule. Rome did not invent sacred landscapes, but it was unmatched at absorbing them, branding them, and making them speak in an imperial accent. Here, that accent is carved in Corinthian capitals and measured in the scale of platforms. In the Roman imagination, a temple complex was never just a place to pray, even when devotion was sincere. It was also a map of power, built in stone so that authority could be walked, climbed, and seen. Processional courtyards controlled how crowds moved, where they paused, and what they looked at next. Lines that still hold direction, despite erosion and centuries of dust. The wall is not chaotic rubble. It is deliberate, measured, and stubbornly precise. Mass estimates vary by method and density assumptions, yet they commonly land in the many hundreds of tons per block. Limestone density is typically around 2.3 to 2.7 grams per cubic centimetre, depending on porosity and composition. That range sounds small, but when you multiply it by tens of cubic meters, the uncertainty becomes tens of tons. Even the conservative numbers remain far beyond ordinary ancient building stone. Those numbers also hide another detail that engineers care about: where the weight actually concentrates. A block can be enormous, yet if it rests unevenly during transport, stress focuses at corners and edges. Limestone is strong in compression, but it can crack when bending forces appear. At this scale, the stone's own weight becomes a structural load that must be managed continuously. Numbers matter because they constrain stories, and they punish casual exaggeration. A modern mobile crane that lifts several hundred tons is specialized, expensive, and limited by setup space. It needs outriggers, stable ground, and a carefully controlled radius, because leverage turns small errors into tipping moments. Even today, moving a single block of this mass requires engineered ground, controlled routes, and careful risk management. The question is not whether ancient people could move heavy stone, but how they managed precision at this extreme. Ancient builders moved obelisks, statues, and monoliths, and we have evidence for ramps, sledges, and coordinated hauling. What makes Baalbek different is the combination of mass, placement height, and tight tolerances in a finished wall. It is one thing to drag a stone into a courtyard, and another to seat it perfectly in a course. Precision is not a luxury here, because a retaining wall behaves like a system, not like a sculpture. If one block sits slightly proud, the next course cannot bed properly, and gaps become pathways for movement. Over decades, small voids can invite water, sediment, and freeze-thaw damage. The trilithon's clean bedding suggests careful preparation, and careful preparation implies time. The Roman context is partly clear, and partly frustratingly silent in the way ancient history often is. Architectural style ties the visible temple complex to the Roman imperial period, especially the 1st to 3rd centuries CE. The Temple of Jupiter dominates the imagination, while other sanctuaries and courtyards organize movement like a scripted procession. The layout is not accidental. It is designed to impress, to orient bodies, and to choreograph awe. Roman builders also worked within a professional culture that prized measurement and repeatable technique. Surveyors used gromus and measuring rods to establish right angles and long alignments. Masons followed standardized proportions, and stonecutters worked to templates that could be shared across teams. When you look at the courtyards, you're also looking at a discipline of planning. Inscriptions and dedicatory evidence point to official patronage and local elites competing for prestige. A city like Heliopolis could prosper by becoming a destination, drawing pilgrims, merchants, and administrators. Monumental building also created jobs, contracts, and supply networks, which tied local economies to imperial favour. The cultural function is legible: grand temples as political theatre, religious authority, and economic magnet. Yet the trilithon sits inside a platform system that feels older than the decorative programme above it. The stones are less about surface display and more about foundational ambition. Their placement suggests that the platform was conceived as a heavy-duty retaining structure, not merely a stage. When you stand near the wall, you feel the difference between architecture meant to be seen and engineering meant to endure. The Romans often built on earlier sacred precincts, expanding them and rebranding them. They did this across the empire because sacred continuity could be politically useful, even when theology shifted. At Baalbek, that possibility is not a fringe add-on, but a serious archaeological question. If earlier phases exist, they complicate who designed the platform logic that the trilithon completes. We move from history to stone because stone keeps a different kind of record. Text can vanish, and inscriptions can be selective, but tool marks and quarry scars preserve process. The limestone used at Baalbek has a local signature, and nearby quarries still show extraction scars. Not far from the temple complex, unfinished megaliths lie where they were abandoned, like sentences left mid-word. They include blocks comparable in size to the trilithon, and in some cases even larger. One of the most famous unfinished stones is often cited at over 1,000 tons, depending on how its volume is calculated. Its scale is shocking, but its incompletion is equally informative. It suggests that builders tested limits, revised plans, and sometimes stopped when risk or feasibility changed. In the quarry, the stone feels less like a monument and more like a process frozen in place. The bedrock shows straight cuts that define edges and rough channels that once guided wedges. Dust gathers in shallow grooves, and small plants root where tools once bit. The unfinished blocks sit half-freed, as if the last command to move never came. The quarry evidence anchors the mystery in measurable geography, which is where speculation must begin to behave. These blocks were not imported from distant mountains, which would multiply transport difficulty. They were cut from local bedrock, which suggests a planned supply chain and knowledge of workable strata. Quarrying is geology in practice, and it rewards those who understand the rock's weaknesses. The unfinished stones also show that the builders were willing to attempt extreme sizes, even if they could not always complete the plan. A block can fail for many reasons: hidden fractures, unexpected bedding planes, or a misjudged slope on the extraction face. Sometimes the problem is not cutting, but moving, and a stone can be abandoned because the next step is too dangerous. In that sense, the quarry is a laboratory of ancient decision-making. Archaeologists connect quarry to monument with more than proximity, because proximity can mislead. Petrography compares thin sections under microscope, matching mineral texture and fossil content. In limestone, you can see microfossils, shell fragments, and cement patterns that reflect specific depositional environments. Those microscopic signatures can link a wall block to a particular layer in the quarry. Geochemical signatures can further distinguish limestone beds that look similar to the naked eye. Trace elements and isotopic ratios can act like a fingerprint, especially when multiple strata are available. When quarry stone and wall stone align, the sourcing claim becomes a testable argument, not a convenient assumption. The science does not solve the engineering, but it narrows the map of possibilities. Tool marks add another layer of constraint, and they speak in the grammar of labour. Extraction scars show channels, wedge points, and systematic cutting that implies organised teams. Workers often cut trenches around a block, then separated it from the bed with wedges, levers, and careful undercutting. The marks are consistent with known ancient stoneworking methods, including iron tools in the Roman period. They also show limits, because cutting a block is only the first act, and moving it is the longer problem. A stone can be freed from the bed and still be impossible to transport safely. Once detached, it must be stabilised, supported, and protected from cracking under its own weight. At hundreds of tons, even minor torsion can propagate fractures that ruin the piece. Transport theories begin with the simplest physics, because physics does not negotiate with ambition. A block this massive cannot be carried, and it cannot be bounced over rough ground. It must be dragged or rolled, and the ground must be prepared to avoid sinking. The pressure under a concentrated load can exceed what soils can bear, especially when moisture changes. Friction becomes the main enemy, and friction scales with weight, so small improvements matter. The force required to pull a load is roughly the coefficient of friction multiplied by the normal force. Reduce friction a little and you reduce required manpower a lot, which is why lubrication and track preparation are not minor details. In ancient engineering, efficiency often comes from managing surfaces, not inventing miracles. One plausible model uses sledges on prepared tracks, a method attested in multiple ancient contexts. A wooden sledge spreads load, while a packed track reduces deformation and ruts. The track could be layered with timber, brush, or stone chips to distribute pressure. If the route was used repeatedly, it might be maintained like a road, with crews repairing damage as they went. Lubrication with water, oil, or wet clay can reduce friction further, especially on limestone dust. There is iconographic evidence from Egypt showing workers pouring liquid in front of sledges, which suggests practical knowledge of friction reduction. Water can create a thin slurry that prevents dry grinding, while clay can act as a primitive bearing layer. Experiments with smaller stones show that lubrication can cut required pulling force dramatically, though scaling remains uncertain. Scaling is the crucial caution, because materials behave differently under extreme loads. Wood compresses, ropes stretch, and soil compacts, and each change alters the system's stability. A sledge that works at 10 tons may fail at 500 if its runners crush or its joints shear. That does not make the method impossible, but it demands smarter design, better timber, and constant monitoring. Rollers are often imagined, yet rollers introduce their own failure modes. Under extreme loads, rollers can crush, jam, or wander sideways on uneven ground. Rolling also demands constant repositioning, which slows progress and increases coordination demands. Sliding on a controlled track may be more stable than rolling, even if it seems less elegant. There is also a subtle issue of control because moving is only half the challenge. A rolling block can accelerate unexpectedly on slight slopes, and stopping it safely is difficult. Sliding systems, while harder to start, can be easier to break with wedges, ropes, and incremental hauling. For ancient crews, predictability could be worth more than speed. Capstans and winches offer mechanical advantage, but they require anchors and disciplined operation. Anchors can be dead men buried in soil, rock-cut sockets, or heavy counterweights. The surrounding terrain would need to accommodate these anchor points without collapsing. A winch system also needs space, because ropes must run cleanly without snagging. Rope strength becomes a limiting factor, and ropes must be protected from abrasion. Ancient ropes could be made from hemp, flax, or other fibers, and their breaking strength depends on diameter, twist, and wear. Under heavy load, a rope that rubs against stone can fail quickly, which is why wooden sheaves, padding, and careful routing matter. The system also needs rhythm, because a sudden jerk can snap lines or shift the load catastrophically. Seasonality may have been part of the solution, and it would have been planned like a campaign. Wet seasons can soften ground and increase sinking risk, yet they can also provide water for lubrication. Dry seasons harden tracks, but increase dust and friction unless water is added deliberately. Winter hauling is sometimes proposed, yet Bakar winters are variable, and ice is not a reliable assumption. Temperature and humidity also affect materials, which is easy to forget. Wood swells and shrinks, ropes change flexibility, and soils change bearing capacity as moisture shifts. A project manager in antiquity would not use those terms, but they would know the patterns. The timing of a haul could be as important as the design of the sledge. Gradient is the quiet killer in every model, because gravity is relentless and indifferent. A slope that feels trivial to a walker becomes decisive at hundreds of tons. Even a 1% incline adds a large component of downhill force that must be controlled. If the route includes rises, the hauling force must increase beyond what steady teams can sustain. This is why route reconstruction matters as much as tool reconstruction, and why the landscape itself becomes evidence. The quarry sits above the temple complex in some areas, yet the path is not a straight drop. Builders would need a route that avoids sharp turns, soft ground, and sudden grade changes. A longer path with gentler slope can be easier than a short path with a steep section. As you imagine the route, you also have to imagine the work zone around it. Crews would clear stones, level ruts, and possibly lay temporary surfaces, then remove them as the block passed. They would need staging areas for rest, water, and tool repair, because hauling is repetitive and punishing. The soundscape would be constant: shouted cadence, creaking timber, and the low scrape of stone on prepared ground. We also have to account for the final approach and placement, where the margin for error collapses. Moving a block into position is not the same as setting it precisely in a wall. The wall course must be level, the bed must be prepared, and small errors compound. At this scale, a few centimetres matter, and correction is costly. The last meters are where many plausible models become vague because the evidence is thin. To seat a block, builders might use cribbing, levers, and incremental shimming, raising or lowering corners by small amounts. They might use sandbeds that can be drained to lower a stone gently, a technique known in later heavy-moving contexts. However they did it, the process would require patience, not brute force. Construction at this scale also implies constant checking, even if the tools were simple. Plumb lines, water levels, and straight edges can produce remarkable accuracy when used carefully. Masons could test bedding surfaces with thin shims and visual gaps, then redress stone until contact was even. The work is slow, but slow is often what prevents cracking. The construction sequencing puzzle sharpens the tension, because the wall reads like a deliberate choice. Why are the largest blocks placed high in the wall rather than at the base? The intuitive answer is stability through weight, yet weight would also stabilize lower courses. The actual choice suggests a specific construction logic that we do not fully see. One hypothesis is structural, and it treats the trilithon as a kind of engineered belt. Large blocks can act as a continuous tie course, reducing joints and increasing shear resistance. Fewer joints can mean fewer weak points under lateral pressure from fill behind the wall. If the platform retained massive earthworks, a strong upper course could help lock the system. Retaining walls do not fail only by toppling. They can also slide, bulge, or rotate as backfill settles. A long joint-poor course can distribute stress more evenly along the wall. It can also reduce pathways for water infiltration, which matters because water pressure behind a wall can be destructive. In plain terms, fewer cracks can mean fewer ways for the wall to be pushed apart. Another hypothesis is symbolic display, and it treats engineering as rhetoric. Setting colossal stones high makes them visible, turning logistics into propaganda. Romans used scale to signal power, and Baalbek was a stage for imperial authority. Yet symbolism alone does not explain the extra difficulty, unless the difficulty itself was the message. Consider the experience of an ancient visitor approaching the sanctuary. You would climb, pass through courts, and look up at a platform that seems to defy ordinary construction. The mind registers effort even without understanding method, and that recognition can be politically useful. If the Empire can place stones like these, what else can it command? A third hypothesis is construction convenience through ramps, which is both practical and historically plausible. If the platform was built with an earthen ramp, or fill rising alongside it, the working surface could be high. Blocks could be hauled onto the ramp and slid into place at elevation. When construction ended, the ramp could be removed, leaving the stones improbably suspended above ground. Ramps are not a single idea, but a family of solutions, and each has trade-offs. A straight ramp requires enormous volume of fill, while a switchback ramp reduces fill but complicates turns. A ramp must also be stable under load, which means compaction, drainage, and constant repair. If a ramp slumps under a moving megalith, the consequences are immediate and severe. A fourth hypothesis is reuse or completion of an earlier platform design, which returns us to the site's layered identity. If a pre-existing terrace had a certain course height, later builders might have matched it. The trilithon could be a Roman enhancement of an older retaining system, or a completion of a plan inherited from earlier phases. This is where the palimpsest becomes more than metaphor. If earlier builders established a sacred terrace, later builders could inherit constraints they did not choose. They might keep alignments, reuse foundations, and adapt to pre-existing walls, because rebuilding from scratch is expensive. In that scenario, the trilithon becomes a negotiation across centuries. It would be Rome speaking through a sentence begun by someone else. Substructure questions are unavoidable at Baalbek, and they attract both careful research and careless certainty. Claims of pre-Roman foundations range from plausible to exaggerated depending on evidence quality. The responsible approach is to ask what tests can actually discriminate phases. Archaeology answers with stratigraphy. geophysics, and architectural analysis. Stratigraphic excavation looks for construction cuts, fill episodes, and sealed surfaces, because layers are time-made visible. If a wall sits on earlier deposits, those deposits can contain datable material, like ceramics or charcoal. If later builders trench into older layers, the cut edges can show sequence. The problem is access, because deep excavation under monumental structures is limited by conservation and safety. Even when excavation is possible, interpretation must be cautious. A fill layer can be redeposited and artifacts can be mixed, especially in a long-lived site. Dating often relies on the latest object in a sealed context, which provides a terminus after which construction occurred. In plain terms, archaeology can tell you not earlier than, more easily than it can tell you exactly when. Ground-penetrating radar can map subsurface anomalies without digging, which is valuable when stone architecture restricts access. It can detect voids, buried walls, and changes in material density. Yet radar interpretation is probabilistic, and stone-rich context can create confusing reflections. GPR can guide hypotheses, but it cannot replace stratigraphic proof. Other geophysical methods can complement radar depending on conditions. Electrical resistivity can highlight moisture differences that suggest buried features, while magnetometry can detect fired materials or disturbed soils. Each method has limits in urban and stone-heavy environments, and each produces patterns that require careful modelling. The result is not a hidden photograph of the past, but a map of probabilities. Architectural analysis tests phases through bonding patterns, masonry style, and construction tolerances, which are often culturally specific. Romans often used distinctive clamp types, mortar practices, and finishing methods. Earlier phases may show different jointing, different stone sizing, or different orientation logic. If styles interlock, the sequence can be inferred, though certainty still depends on context. You can sometimes see this in the way blocks meet at corners or in the way courses align. A later wall may butt against an earlier one without bonding, revealing a chronological relationship. Differences in tool finish can also matter, because chisels, picks, and saws leave characteristic textures. The wall becomes a document, but it is written in stone grammar. We address myth because Baalbek is a magnet for it, and mystery can invite shortcuts. Popular narratives invoke lost technologies, anti-gravity, or non-human builders. These claims often begin with a real observation, then leap over method. They treat missing documentation as proof of impossibility, rather than as a common feature of ancient labour. It is true that the trilithon feels like a dare, especially when you stand beneath it. The stones are quiet, but they are not neutral, because they challenge modern intuitions about what primitive societies could do. Yet awe is not evidence, and disbelief is not a measurement. The discipline is to stay with what can be tested, even when the answer remains incomplete. Archaeology responds by narrowing unknowns and expanding what is demonstrably possible. Organised labour can move astonishing loads when leadership, provisioning, and technique align. Simple machines scale well, and the limiting factor is often coordination, not invention. The absence of a surviving manual does not mean the absence of practical knowledge. In the Roman world, large projects were also administrative achievements. Someone had to survey alignments, schedule deliveries, and ensure that stonecutters, haulers, and masons were not idle. Someone had to pay wages or allocate rations, and someone had to enforce safety, even if ancient safety looked different from ours. When you think about Baalbek, you're also thinking about bureaucracy, because bureaucracy is how empires move stone. Experimental archaeology helps here, even when it cannot replicate Baalbek's exact mass. Teams can measure pulling force, track wear, rope failure, and manpower requirements. They can test lubrication, roller behaviour, and ramp stability. They can show which ideas fail quickly, which is valuable because it reduces the space of plausible explanations. Experiments also reveal how much depends on small choices. A change in sledge runner shape can alter friction, and a change in rope angle can alter effective load. Even the cadence of pullers matters, because synchronized force reduces shock loading. These are not exotic technologies, they are refinements, and refinements are often what separates success from disaster. Still, experiments also reveal the gap between possibility and proof, which is where honest mystery lives. A model can work in principle, yet remain unconfirmed for this site. We can propose sledges, capstans, and ramps, yet we rarely find the ephemeral traces of those systems. Wood decays, earth ramps are removed, and later construction overwrites the work zone. This is where the chapter's tension peaks, because Baalbek resists a single satisfying diagram. Reasonable models exist, but the exact sequence of operations remains underdetermined by evidence. How many workers were needed, and for how long, and under what administrative system? Were teams local, conscripted, paid, enslaved, or mixed, and how was risk managed? A workforce is not just a number, it is a living system that must be fed and coordinated. Hauling crews need rest cycles, and stonecutters need tool maintenance and resharpening. Animals may have been used for some tasks, but animals also require fodder and water, and they can panic under strain. When you imagine the trilithon's movement, imagine also the camp kitchens, the water carriers, and the supervisors counting time. The Roman state could mobilize resources at scale, and Baalbek's temples show that ambition. Yet imperial capability is not a universal solvent, because logistics still obey physics. Even with thousands of labourers, the system needs planning that prevents bottlenecks. Food, water, shelter, and medical care become part of engineering when projects last years. We also have to consider that the trilithon may not be a single event, but a sequence of decisions. Construction could have been staged, with platform work preceding temple decoration by decades. Political shifts could pause work, then restart it under new patrons. An unfinished quarry block can reflect a change in plan as much as a technical failure. In Rome's provinces, building programs could be tied to emperors, governors, or local benefactors, and those patrons could vanish. A death, a war, or a fiscal crisis could interrupt supply lines and labor organization. When work resumed, priorities could shift, and designs could be modified to fit new budgets or new symbolism. The stone in the quarry may record not defeat, but a pivot. So we hold the distinction that keeps the series honest and the mystery productive. Unexplained does not mean unexplainable. It means the evidence does not yet select one method with confidence, and it means our reconstructions remain provisional. The stones are a challenge to documentation, not a license for fantasy. Baalbek forces a recalibration of ancient capability, and it does so without offering a neat lesson. If we cannot fully explain the logistics here, we may be underestimating how often ancient societies solved extreme problems without leaving readable records. The trilithon becomes a stress test for our assumptions about labour, planning, and the transmission of engineering knowledge. It also becomes a reminder that the past often leaves outcomes, not instructions. There is another observation that lingers, especially at dusk when the site empties and the wind rises. The stones do not advertise the names of the hands that moved them. We remember emperors and cities, but the labourers remain anonymous, even though their coordination is the real miracle. What does it mean that the most enduring part of the project is also the least personal? We return to the platform wall and read it as a statement in stone, both technical and psychological. The course is high, the joints are tight, and the blocks sit where they should not, at least by modern intuition. The faces are dressed to meet cleanly, which implies careful bedding and controlled placement. Above them, later architecture performs power through columns and carving. Beneath them, the ground may still hold older phases that complicate every clean timeline. A buried terrace, an earlier sanctuary, or a different retaining logic could be hidden under later stone. Each possibility is a hypothesis that must be tested, not a story to be declared. The site keeps its secrets the way stone always does, by outlasting the questions. The chapter closes by looping back to the opening hook and by letting the unanswered parts remain visible. Across distant landscapes, the same impossible question rises from the ground. How did our ancestors move, shape, and align stones without leaving a clear record of how or why? And when we cannot reconstruct the method, are we seeing a failure of ancient explanation or a limit in our own evidence? From anomalies drawn across deserts, we move to stones stacked on a scale that seems to defy gravity. Baalbek does not give us a single solution, but it sharpens the standard of proof we should demand. It also reminds us that engineering is a cultural act, because societies build what they value, and they value what they choose to display. From stones raised into the sky, we turn to structures buried into the earth. The next chapter moves to Turkey, where entire complexes lay hidden for millennia, challenging timelines of ritual, settlement, and monumental beginnings. We descend from open-air monuments into a quieter kind of evidence, sealed under soil, muted by time and revealed only by careful cuts. Rolling hills in southeastern Anatolia look ordinary at first glance, with pale grasses bending in wind and scattered stones catching hard sunlight. From a distance, the land reads as calm and continuous, a surface that gives nothing away until it is opened. Then an excavation trench appears like a wound in the earth, and the hillside becomes a cross-section of decisions. Each scraped layer changes the story, because buried architecture preserves sequence, not just silhouette. The camera lingers on bands of sediment, some compact and dark, others loose and chalky, each one a thin chapter. In places, the cut face shows a clean edge where a pit was dug long ago, and the soil on either side does not match. Even the colour shift matters. Iron-stained browns, pale calcareous dust, and charcoal flecks that look like pepper in the Matrix. Here the central question shifts again, from moving stone to burying meaning, because covering something can be as deliberate as building it. Buried structures feel like messages because they were protected from weather, later quarrying, and the slow grinding of everyday reuse. On the surface, stone is exposed to frost, rain, roots, and human opportunism, but underground it can remain sharp-edged. Edges stay crisp, tool scars remain legible, and even delicate relief lines can survive because sunlight never reaches them. Archaeology reads these messages through stratigraphy, where layers record actions in order, like stacked pages that cannot be rearranged without leaving traces. A floor surface, a collapse lens, and a cap of fill can mark decisions, and those decisions can be compared across enclosures. When those decisions repeat across multiple structures, the pattern becomes a cultural signature rather than an accident. A recurring sequence, dig, build, use, repair, then fill, suggests a shared protocol that people recognized. It also forces a question about intention, because repeated behavior implies shared expectations and a memory of how things should be done. What looks like dirt in a trench wall becomes evidence for planning, and planning becomes evidence for social coordination. In that sense, stratigraphy is not just dirt science, it is social history written in sediment. To understand why this matters, we step back into the Anatolian prehistoric timeline, where climate, ecology, and human choices intersect. The late Epipaleolithic to pre-pottery Neolithic transition spans the end of foraging dominance, but it does not erase foraging overnight. People intensify plant use, manage landscapes, and begin longer stays at favoured places, yet mobility remains an option. Sedentism emerges unevenly, with camps becoming villages in some zones, and seasonal aggregation persisting in others. The archaeological record captures that unevenness in architecture, storage, and the density of daily refuse. This transition unfolds against the backdrop of the younger Dryas and the early Holocene, when climate instability gives way to warmer, wetter conditions. In plain terms, the world becomes more predictable, and predictability changes what is worth investing in. Rainfall patterns stabilize, growing seasons lengthen, and plant communities shift in ways that make return visits pay off. Wild stands of cereals can be revisited, tended, and harvested with increasing efficiency, especially when people return to the same valleys. The hills around the upper Euphrates and Tigris sit near a mosaic of ecological niches, where steppe, woodland, and river corridors meet. Domestication is not a single switch, and the dates are regionally staggered, which is why simple stories fail. Wild cereals are harvested and processed before clear genetic domestication appears, and the archaeological record preserves that lag. Sickles can cut wild barley, grinding stones can process wild wheat, and storage pits can hold gathered seed without a single domesticated gene. Over time, repeated harvesting and selective replanting can favour non-shattering ears, but that shift is gradual. The change is visible in plant remains as proportions shift, and in tool wear as repeated cutting leaves microscopic polish on flint edges. Sheep and goats move from managed hunting to herding over centuries, not seasons, and the evidence comes from multiple angles. Age and sex profiles in bone assemblages can shift toward patterns expected in herd management, where young males are culled and females are kept longer. Morphological changes in bones can appear later, and genetic signatures later still, making the timeline complex. Cattle domestication follows a different trajectory, and pigs complicate the picture with local variation, because wild boar are abundant and adaptable. The point is not that people suddenly became farmers, but that they began steering ecosystems, slowly, persistently, and with consequences. This matters because monumental building appears during the transition, not after it's complete, and that timing changes the logic of cause and effect. The older model assumed farming created surplus, then surplus funded monuments, and monuments were the display of settled power. Southeastern Anatolia suggests a different sequence, where gathering and ritual could organise labour first, and labour could create new social obligations. If that is true, monuments may have helped catalyse settled life, rather than merely reflecting it. The stones become less like trophies of agriculture and more like engines of social change. The implication is unsettling in the best way, because it suggests belief and coordination can be primary forces. A community does not need fields of domesticated grain to agree on a project, but it does need shared reasons to show up. Those reasons can be seasonal, social and symbolic, promises, obligations, and the pull of a place that feels necessary. If repeated gatherings become essential to identity, people may begin to manage food to meet those gatherings reliably. In that sense, agriculture can be pulled forward by social demand, not pushed forward by hunger alone. Our primary case focus is the Göbekli Tepe style of monumental enclosure, described without overclaiming and without turning uncertainty into spectacle. Circular or oval spaces are defined by stone rings and internal pillars set into sockets and aligned with care. The pillars are T-shaped, often paired, and sometimes arranged around a central set that dominates the interior. Carved reliefs depict animals and abstract signs, cut with confident control, and the stone surface still holds the marks of tools. Even in close-up, you can see where a chisel bit skated, corrected and returned, evidence of hands, not legends. Visually, the enclosures read like rooms without roofs, yet they are not houses in any ordinary sense. The camera moves along a pillar edge, where a carved fox seems to run across the limestone, its body stretched in motion. In the low light of a trench, shadows deepen the relief, and the carvings appear to shift as the angle changes. Dust clings to the grooves, and the contrast between smooth-dressed stone and rough fill becomes stark. A breeze carries grit across the excavation, and the soundscape is mostly trowels, brushes, and quiet voices. Secure points come first, because the mystery must rest on dated context rather than on awe. Radiocarbon dates come from associated organic remains in relevant layers, not from the stone itself, because stone contains no carbon clock. Charcoal from hearths, bone collagen from animal remains, and short-lived plant materials can all provide dates when preservation allows. Calibrated ranges cluster in the early pre-pottery Neolithic, with multiple phases across centuries. The calibration step matters because atmospheric carbon changes over time, and raw radiocarbon years must be translated into calendar probability. Stratigraphy shows construction episodes, remodeling, and later infilling that seals earlier surfaces, and that sequence is the backbone of interpretation. A builder's cut slices into older sediment, and its outline remains visible as a sharp boundary. A floor layer can be resurfaced multiple times, creating thin laminae that record repeated maintenance. Later, fill can bury everything quickly, turning an active space into a sealed archive. When the camera traces a profile line, it is tracing time, one decision stacked on another. Debates begin where evidence thins, and we keep them visible rather than smoothing them away. Was this a permanent settlement, a ritual centre, or a seasonal gathering place that was empty most of the year? How many people were involved, and how often did they return, given the labour implied by the stones? Were enclosures built by a single community, or by networks sharing a monument vocabulary across valleys and ridges? Each model carries a different picture of social scale, and each must match the material constraints. The architecture forces a question about organisation, because the stones are heavy, and the work is coordinated across tasks. Quarrying, shaping, transport and erection require planning and shared labour, and the steps must be sequenced correctly. A pillar cannot be erected before its socket is prepared, and a ring wall cannot be stabilised without careful placement. Yet the associated domestic signatures can be limited depending on area and phase, and that tension drives interpretation. Monumentality without obvious households is not impossible, but it is demanding to explain. Big projects do not always leave big houses, especially if the builders did not live on site year-round. Domestic debris can be scattered, cleaned away, or located in areas not yet excavated, and absence is not proof. Still, archaeologists look for hearths, storage facilities, middens, and dense distributions of everyday tools, because those features anchor claims of residence. When those signatures are faint, the site begins to look like a destination rather than a village. The difference is subtle in dirt but enormous in social implication. Scientific details anchor the inferences, and they also reveal uncertainty, which is part of the honesty of the method. Radiocarbon dating targets charcoal, bone collagen, and short-lived plant remains where possible, because long-lived wood can introduce old wood effects. Samples must be carefully chosen, cleaned, and pre-treated to remove contaminants that would skew results. Bayesian modelling can refine sequences when stratigraphic relationships are clear, but it cannot invent precision where the layers are ambiguous. The math is powerful, yet it remains tethered to field notes and careful sampling. The results still produce ranges, not single years, and those ranges must be respected in narration and in interpretation. A date is a probability distribution, not a calendar stamp, and multiple dates must be compared as a set. When calibrated ranges overlap, phases may be close in time, but they may also be separated by decades that matter socially. The difference between a generation and a century can change how we imagine memory, tradition, and leadership. How long does a building tradition persist before it becomes something else? Still familiar, but no longer the same. Stratigraphy does more than date, because it distinguishes use from later disturbance, and it can reveal how a place changed function. Construction cuts show where builders dug into earlier sediments to seat stones, and those cuts can be mapped to reconstruct building plans. Floor layers show trampling, resurfacing, and localized activity areas, sometimes visible as darker patches or compacted zones. Collapse and weathering lenses can mark exposure intervals before burial, suggesting pauses in use. Even a thin band of windblown dust can hint at a season when the space stood open and quiet. Micromorphology tests the sediments at microscopic scale, turning soil into readable structure, and it often overturns first impressions. A thin section under polarized light can show compacted floors with oriented particles, indicating repeated foot traffic. It can reveal ash particles, phytoliths from plant tissues, and microcharcoal that signals burning even when no hearth is obvious. It can distinguish natural slope wash from dumped fill by sorting and fabric, and it can show whether a surface was walked repeatedly or covered quickly. In plain language, it tells us whether a layer is lived in, weathered, or dumped. The visuals shift from trench walls to laboratory benches, where a small slice of earth becomes a window into behavior. Under the microscope, mineral grains glitter, voids appear as dark channels, and tiny fragments of bone or charcoal sit embedded like fossils. The narrator slows, because this is where the story becomes technical but also intimate. A single millimeter can hold the difference between a season of use and a single day of dumping. When you see that difference, the past feels less like a myth and more like a schedule. Artifact assemblages add behavioral texture without pretending to read minds, and they work best when paired with spatial analysis. Lithic tools and debitage indicate on-site napping and maintenance, because flakes are the byproduct of making and resharpening. Tool types can suggest hunting and butchery, plant processing and woodworking tasks, although functions overlap. Useware studies can add another layer because edge rounding and polish can reveal contact with hide, wood, or silica-rich grasses. Variation across areas can imply specialized activity zones rather than uniform occupation, especially when concentrations align with architectural features. Raw material sourcing can add another layer, because stone does not travel silently. If obsidian appears, its geological signature can sometimes be traced to distant volcanic sources, implying exchange or travel. Even local flint can show patterns, where certain nodules are preferred for particular tool forms. These details do not prove a pilgrimage network by themselves, but they help map the scale of interaction. When a material arrives from far away, it raises a quiet question. What else travelled with it besides stone? Cut marks on animal bone provide another line of evidence for gatherings and provisioning, and they can be read with forensic care. Butchery patterns can indicate carcass transport decisions and processing intensity, because different cuts reflect different stages of disassembly. Species representation can suggest hunting focus and seasonal availability, especially when combined with age profiles and habitat preferences. Burned bone and fragmented remains can point to cooking and marrow extraction, which often intensify when many people are fed. Even the distribution of bone fragments across spaces can hint at where food was prepared, consumed, and discarded. Feasting hypotheses rise where dense food debris clusters with communal architecture, and the idea is compelling because it links social life to material traces. Large quantities of bone, repeated hearth features, and serving-related artifacts can support the model, especially if deposition is episodic. Chemical residues can sometimes add support, because fats and proteins can soak into porous surfaces and persist in trace form. Yet feasting is hard to prove conclusively, because everyday meals can also accumulate over long periods. The responsible claim is about scale and patterning, not certainty, and the pattern must be tested against alternative explanations. One alternative is that a site accumulates debris simply because it is revisited repeatedly, even for small gatherings, and time does the rest. Another is that certain areas become designated dumping zones, concentrating remains regardless of event size. Archaeologists therefore look for rapid deposition signatures, such as mixed materials in single lenses or repeated discrete layers separated by clean surfaces. The question is not only what happened, but how fast it happened, because speed changes meaning. A single intense episode feels different from a slow, unremarkable accumulation. Labour organisation is inferred through logistics, not through romantic images of builders, and logistics leave their own fingerprints. Quarry scars show extraction methods and repeated removal of blocks, sometimes visible as negative shapes in bedrock. Standardised pillar forms imply shared templates and skilled stoneworkers, because consistent proportions require practiced judgment. The more uniform the output, the more likely knowledge was transmitted deliberately, through apprenticeship, repetition, and correction. Transport routes are hypothesized from topography and wear traces, but direct evidence is often missing, and that absence must remain part of the narrative. Even without wheels or draft animals, heavy stone can be moved with leverage, rollers, sledges, and coordinated pulling, but each method requires planning. The ground must be prepared, obstacles cleared, and timing coordinated, because a single failure can crack a pillar. The work also requires food, water, and rest, which ties labour back to provisioning and scheduling. When we imagine the building process, we should imagine not only strength, but organisation under constraints. We should also imagine the sound, ropes tightening, voices counting, stone scraping, then the sudden hush when it finally settles. Seasonal gathering models fit some data, because hunting cycles and plant harvests create predictable congregation windows, and predictability supports tradition. Short-term aggregation can still build monuments if repeated over years, because repeated effort accumulates like sediment. Repetition creates tradition, and tradition can mobilize labor without centralized states or formal bureaucracy. This is one way to reconcile monumentality with limited domestic debris, and it keeps the focus on networks rather than on permanent populations. A monument can be built by a calendar, not just by a town. But seasonal models also raise questions that the evidence can only partly answer. If people gathered for a few weeks each year, who maintained the site in the meantime, and who decided when to return? Did certain groups claim custodianship, or did the place itself carry enough authority to draw people back? How were disputes managed when many families converged, and did the architecture help channel movement and attention? These questions remain open, but the architecture invites them. It is hard to look at planned stone circles and not wonder about planned social rules. Iconography is the chapter's second axis, because the carvings are not incidental decoration, and their placement suggests deliberate communication. Animal motifs dominate, including predators, snakes, boars, birds, and other species that would have been familiar and feared. Some reliefs are naturalistic, others stylized, and some combine forms in ways that resist simple identification. Abstract symbols appear alongside animals, suggesting a shared sign system that was meaningful to insiders. The repetition implies convention, and convention implies teaching. Someone had to learn what counted as correct. The camera tracks across a panel where a line of snakes seems to ripple, their bodies carved in shallow relief. Nearby, a boar's bristled back catches the light, and the stone surface looks almost alive. The lens pauses on the negative space between figures, where the carver chose what to leave untouched. These are not random scratches, and they are not casual doodles made in spare time. They are images placed where they would be seen, remembered, and perhaps debated. The pillars themselves blur the line between object and figure, because T-shapes read as human-like even before details are noticed. Some show carved arms, hands, belts, and loincloth-like elements, positioned as if the pillar wears them. The hands sometimes meet at the front, a posture that can feel formal, almost ceremonial, without telling us why. If pillars are anthropomorphic, they may represent persons, ancestors, or mythic beings, and that possibility changes how we interpret the space. The evidence supports the human-like reading, while the identity remains interpretive, and that boundary must be held. In a dim trench, the central pair of pillars can feel like presences rather than supports, because they stand facing inward. The surrounding ring of pillars can feel like an audience, or a boundary, or both at once. This is where architecture and iconography fuse because the layout shapes how images are encountered. The question becomes not only what is depicted, but how the space choreographs attention. Where do you stand, where do you look, and who is allowed to stand beside you? Interpretive frameworks must be presented as competing models with predictions, because archaeology advances by testing what should be true if a model is right. A ritual center model predicts repeated gatherings, special deposits, and controlled access patterns, possibly including entrances that channel movement. A pilgrimage node model predicts regional connectivity and convergence from multiple catchments, which might be visible in diverse raw materials or stylistic variation. Clan or lineage marker models predict repeated motifs and spatial partitioning that map social groups, perhaps with distinct iconographic clusters. Each model asks for different kinds of evidence, and the ground answers unevenly. Cosmological storytelling models treat iconography as narrative, encoding relationships between humans, animals, and forces that structure the world. This can explain repetition and structured placement of motifs across pillars, because narratives often rely on recurring characters and roles. Yet narrative cannot be reconstructed directly without texts, so claims must stay bounded and cautious. The carvings show intention and shared meanings, not a readable script, and that distinction matters. We can see the grammar of repetition, but not the sentences that were spoken. We also address the temptation to overinterpret, because the imagery is vivid and the silence is deep, and humans dislike silence. A snake carved in stone does not automatically mean a single myth, and it does not automatically imply a universal symbol. A predator scene does not automatically mean warfare or shamanism or astronomy, even if those ideas are tempting. Archaeology can test context, distribution, and sequence, but it cannot retrieve lost speech, and that limit is part of the mystery. The discipline is to let the images remain powerful without forcing them to confess. Still, restraint does not mean emptiness, because patterns can be real even when meanings are lost. If certain animals appear more often on certain pillars, and those pillars occupy consistent positions, the distribution itself becomes evidence. If abstract signs recur in multiple enclosures, they may indicate shared conventions, even if we cannot translate them. The task is to describe what is structured, then ask what kinds of social processes create structure. Why do some motifs cluster, and why do others remain rare? Was rarity itself a form of power? The burial enigma becomes the chapter's central mystery, because these sites were not simply abandoned and left to decay. Evidence indicates deliberate backfilling in several enclosures and phases, and the fill is not always what natural processes would deliver. Fill can include limestone rubble, broken tools, animal bone, and sediment that looks transported from elsewhere. The result is a rapid sealing that preserves architecture like a closed container, as if the builders wanted the space to survive in darkness. The paradox is immediate. Why build to gather people, then hide what you built? We define what counts as deliberate burial, because natural accumulation can mimic intent, especially over centuries. Natural processes tend to sort sediments by water and wind, producing layered textures and predictable grading, with finer particles settling differently than larger stones. Deliberate dumping tends to mix sizes, include cultural debris, and show repeated tipping lenses, where each load creates a sloping micro-layer. Micromorphology and sedimentology can separate these processes when sampling is careful, and when profiles are documented precisely. The difference can be visible in the way particles fit together, ordered by nature or jumbled by human hands. Soil composition matters, because it can reveal where fill came from, and origin is a clue to effort. If fill matches nearby slope deposits, natural wash becomes plausible, especially after heavy rains. If fill includes materials not present in local natural layers, transport becomes likely, and transport implies intention. Artifact mixes also matter, because random background scatter differs from concentrated dumped assemblages. and concentration suggests purposeful movement of debris. Even the presence of broken tools can be read two ways: trash from daily life or fragments chosen for closure. In some profiles, the fill looks like a chaotic stew of rubble and cultural fragments, with no gentle sorting. In others, it shows repeated lenses that imply multiple dumping events, perhaps over days or weeks. The camera returns to the trench wall, where the boundary between floor and fill is sharp, almost like a lid. That sharpness is an argument because it suggests closure rather than gradual forgetting. A sealed surface implies a last moment. Someone stood there, then chose to end it. Hypotheses for why people buried in closures must remain plural, because the evidence can support more than one and motives can overlap. Ritual closure models treat burial as a final act that ends a structure's social life, like sealing a tomb or retiring a powerful object. Rebuilding cycle models treat burial as preparation for new construction nearby or above, where closing one space enables another. Social change models treat burial as a response to shifting identities, alliances, or subsistence strategies, where old symbols no longer fit new realities. In each case, burial is not absence, it is action with consequences. Protection models suggest burial preserves sacred spaces from desecration or weathering, even if the builders left or moved. Practical abandonment models suggest people filled hazards, stabilized terrain, or repurposed stone sources, and practicality can coexist with belief. None of these can be selected alone without stronger correlates, such as patterned deposits or clear signs of ritualized closure. The key point is that burial appears active, not merely passive, and activity demands explanation. If the fill was carried and dumped repeatedly, then the final act required as much coordination as the first. The act of burial also reframes monumentality, because it turns visibility into a choice rather than a default. Many monuments are built to be seen across distance, but these were made invisible, and invisibility can be meaningful. Was the power of the place considered dangerous, requiring containment, or was it considered precious, requiring preservation? Did burial mark an ending, or did it mark a transformation, where the monument becomes part of the hill itself? The hill stops being a backdrop and becomes the monument's second skin. We widen beyond a single famous site, because Turkey holds multiple buried and semi-buried traditions, and a regional view prevents overfitting one narrative. Neighbouring sites in the region show related pillar forms, enclosures, and settlement patterns, suggesting shared ideas moving across communities. Some are smaller, some more domestic, and some show different relationships between ritual and daily life, which helps test the range of possibilities. The regional pattern suggests a vocabulary of building and symbolism, not a single, isolated miracle. Vocabulary implies conversation, even if we cannot hear the words. Buried mysteries also include later subterranean and semi-subterranean architectures, which complicate the word buried and keep the theme alive across time. In some periods, people dug into soft rock for storage, refuge, and thermal stability, because underground spaces buffer heat and cold. In others, structures were covered by later building, flood deposits, or slope movement, and the burial was accidental. Buried can mean intentional, accidental, or geological, and each pathway leaves different signatures in sediment, damage, and preservation. A collapsed roof looks different from a sealed floor, and a flood layer behaves differently than dumped rubble. Later reuse of landscapes is a recurring Anatolian theme, because sacred places attract rebuilding, and rebuilding creates palimpsests. A hill that holds a Neolithic enclosure can later hold Iron Age, Roman, or medieval activity, because high ground and memory both draw people. Each phase can cut into earlier layers, or seal them under new surfaces, and both outcomes matter. This is why stratigraphic control is not optional, and why context is the real artifact, not the spectacular stone alone. The past survives not because it is strong, but because it is protected by sequence. The camera pulls back to show the hill as a whole, then returns to the trench, emphasizing the contrast between simplicity and complexity. From a distance, the mound is just a rise in the landscape, but inside it is architecture, debris, and time. Every trowel scrape risks destroying a relationship between layers, which is why excavation is slow and documentation obsessive. In a sense, archaeologists unbury with one hand while burying again with notebooks, photographs, and samples. The archive they create is another kind of fill, carefully ordered so the site can be revisited in data. The chapter escalates tension by returning to the series hook, now sharpened by burial and by the discipline required to interpret it. Across 4 landscapes, the same impossible question rises from the ground, but it changes shape in each place. How did people move and shape stone, and why did they sometimes hide what they built? Turkey adds a new verb to the mystery, because burying is also a form of construction, and construction can be an act of forgetting or of safeguarding. The act of covering becomes a final architectural gesture, quiet, heavy, and irreversible. The stakes rise because the sites challenge the causal story of civilization, and they do so with stubborn stratigraphic facts. If monument building predates full farming, then social complexity is not a simple product of agriculture, and the direction of influence may be reversed. Large communal projects can appear among groups still hunting and gathering heavily, which forces us to reconsider what motivates cooperation. Cooperation, belief, and shared identity may be engines that pull subsistence change forward, rather than passive outcomes of it. The question becomes uncomfortable and exhilarating. What if meaning, not surplus, was the first infrastructure? This does not erase the role of farming, but it changes the direction of influence and the sequence we imagine. Communal gatherings can create demand for predictable food, which encourages cultivation, storage, and perhaps new rules about access. Ritual calendars can stabilize seasonal movement, which encourages longer stays and investment in place. Monumental places can become anchors that turn landscapes into territories, because repeated return creates claims, memories, and boundaries. Once a place becomes an anchor, even small changes in climate or politics can ripple outward through the network. In plain language, a big shared project can make people live differently, even if their tools and diets change slowly. A place that matters can reorganize schedules, relationships, and obligations, and those social changes can reshape ecology. When people return to the same valleys, they may burn, clear, or tend vegetation, and those actions feed back into resource availability. The landscape becomes partly human-made, even before domestication is complete. The hill itself becomes a record of feedback, human choices shaping resources, then resources shaping choices. We also confront what is still missing, because the chapter is about unexplained discoveries, not solved puzzles with neat endings. We lack direct evidence for leadership structures that organize labor, such as clear elite residences or formal administrative tools. We lack clear documentation of how decisions were made to close and bury enclosures, and whether those decisions were contested. We lack the spoken narratives that would explain why certain animals and symbols mattered, and why some images were chosen over others. The silence is not failure. It is the condition of deep time. Yet we have enough to replace disbelief with disciplined wonder, and disciplined wonder is a powerful stance. We can date phases, map sequences, and test formation processes, which turns mystery into structured inquiry. We can compare tool assemblages, faunal remains, and sediment fabrics across contexts, looking for consistent associations. We can build models that predict where similar sites might lie, still buried under unremarkable hills, waiting for a trench to cut through silence. The most unsettling thought is that the next discovery may already be underfoot, hidden by grass and ordinary stone. The chapter's closing transition ties the 4 regions into a single comparative question, using difference to sharpen what they share. Belgium's standing stones survive as exposed punctuation in a crowded landscape, visible because they were never fully erased. Chile's anomalies persist on open surfaces where preservation is harshly clean, and where the elements strip away softer traces. Lebanon's trilithons compress imperial power into engineered mass, and their scale advertises authority. Each landscape teaches a different lesson about what survives: exposure, endurance, or sheer weight. Turkey's buried structures invert the pattern, because the monument is preserved by being hidden, and hidden preservation feels like a choice. The comparison forces a deeper question about human needs across distance and time, because each landscape holds a different solution. Are we seeing different answers to the same pressures of memory, identity, and coordination, shaped by ecology and history? Or are we seeing faint evidence of connections that history has not yet traced, carried by movement, exchange, and shared imagination? If the same impulses recur, what changes is the medium: standing stone, open desert, imperial platform, or sealed hill. We end by returning to the conclusion theme, without resolving what cannot be resolved and without claiming more than the ground can support. These sites are not evidence of impossibility, but of ingenuity and choice is what makes them human. People shaped stone and soil to hold memory, power, and meaning, even when they later covered it and walked away. The missing pieces are not only technical, but social, and the ground still holds them, quiet, layered, and waiting. The last image is not of a pillar, but of a profile wall, time exposed for a moment before it is covered again. From structures buried into the earth, we move toward the series' final synthesis, where patterns across continents become harder to dismiss as coincidence. The next chapter carries the question forward, asking what our methods still cannot see, and what future discoveries might force us to rewrite again. We step back from 4 case studies and hold them in one frame. Belgium's standing stones, weathered uprights in fields that have been ploughed for centuries, their edges softened by rain, frost, and the slow chemistry of soil. Chile's desert geoglyphs and root marks, dark lines and pale scrapes that only fully resolve from above, where the desert skin reads like a map. Lebanon's trilithons and quarry giants, blocks so large they seem to ignore the scale of human bodies, as if gravity itself were being negotiated. Turkey's buried enclosures and sealed sequences, carved rings and pillars preserved because someone chose to hide them, turning abandonment into a kind of protection. In montage, the camera moves from wet grass to sun-baked gravel, from limestone quarries to hilltop excavations, and the light itself changes the mood of each place. The cuts are quick, but the question is slow, and it returns with new edges. What drives humans to monumentalize space, then sometimes erase it, reuse it, or bury it, as though permanence and impermanence were part of the same plan? Why build something meant to outlast a lifetime, and then treat that same thing as raw material, a convenient store of shaped stone? Comparison sharpens what each site alone can blur, because isolation can make any monument feel like an exception. A single monument can be explained away as a local oddity, or a one-time political stunt, or the vanity of a ruler we never meet. 4 regions, separated by oceans and millennia, force us to ask what is shared in the human toolkit. Not a secret technology, but a recurring impulse to make place visible, durable, and socially binding, an impulse that turns geography into memory. A pattern is not a proof, and similarity is not a connection, no matter how tempting the montage feels. Archaeology treats global pattern claims as hypotheses. Interpretation. Charcoal can be older than the event that burned it, especially if old wood was collected from deadfall. Bones can be moved by animals or later digging, and a displaced sample can quietly rewrite a timeline. That is why context matters as much as chemistry, and why excavation notes can be as valuable as lab results. A sample sealed under a socket packing tells a different story than a fragment in a disturbed layer, where centuries of mixing can blur cause and effect. The best chronologies are built from multiple samples and multiple contexts, then tested for internal agreement like cross-checking witnesses to the same event. When the dates disagree, the disagreement becomes a clue, not merely a problem. The second test is shared material signatures that travel with people, because ideas often leave physical companions. Trade goods, exotic raw materials, and distinctive tool traditions can mark corridors of interaction, even when monuments themselves are local. When a stone monument is near imported obsidian, marine shell far inland, or a non-local metal alloy, it suggests more than local improvisation. It suggests networks, sometimes fragile, sometimes robust, that can carry stories, rituals, and techniques. Material signatures can be subtle, and they can be missed without specialized analysis or careful sampling. Petrography can identify a stone source by mineral texture and inclusions, like a fingerprint in crystalline form, readable under a microscope. Isotopic analysis can track where an animal grazed or where a person grew up by the chemistry locked in teeth and bone. Even trace elements in ceramics can reveal whether pots were made locally or carried across valleys and coasts. The third test is shared technologies in detail, not in headlines, because broad categories can hide crucial differences. Quarrying methods, dressing styles, socket construction and transport traces can converge or diverge under close measurement, and those details resist storytelling shortcuts. A chisel mark is not just a mark, it has width, angle and rhythm that can imply tool type and technique. The spacing of marks can even hint at the worker's stance, and the sequence of blows, as though the stone remembers the motion. Technology leaves negative evidence as well as positive, and sometimes the negatives are the most telling. A quarry face can preserve extraction scars, wedge holes, and abandoned roughouts, frozen mid-process when a plan changed. A transport route can preserve ruts, crushed gravel, or compacted soils that differ from surrounding ground, even when the surface looks ordinary. In some cases, microwear on stones can show repeated dragging, where grit and pressure polish edges in a consistent direction. Even the way a stone is seated can be diagnostic because stability is engineered, not accidental. Packing stones can be selected by size and shape, arranged to resist rocking, and locked with clay or rubble, creating a composite foundation. A socket can be cut, lined, and drained, because water and frost can slowly lever a monument apart over decades. These are small decisions, but they accumulate into a signature of practice, and practice can travel. The fourth test is genetic and linguistic evidence, carefully and with caveats, because people and ideas do not move in simple packages. Population movement can be visible in genomes, while language families can suggest contact, though neither maps cleanly onto monuments. People can adopt ideas without moving, and they can move without leaving obvious monuments, especially if they enter regions with different traditions. Even when genetic shifts are clear, the social mechanism, migration, marriage networks, or elite dominance can remain uncertain. Genetic signals are powerful, but they are not a simple arrow on a map, and they rarely point to a single event. A genome can show admixture events, bottlenecks, and expansions, yet it rarely tells us who built what at a specific hilltop or quarry. Linguistic patterns can preserve ancient contacts, but languages can spread through trade, prestige, or conquest, and they can replace older tongues without erasing older stones. The evidence is real, but the interpretation must stay disciplined. The fifth test asks whether travel was feasible, not just imaginable, because feasibility is where romance meets physics. Nautical capability, prevailing winds, coastal stepping stones, and overland bottlenecks constrain who could meet whom and when. A map invites fantasy, but currents and seasons impose physics, and physics does not negotiate. Even a short sea crossing can be impossible in the wrong season, and trivial in the right one. Feasibility includes the mundane details that decide outcomes, and those details are often decisive. Can a boat carry water and food for the crossing, and can it land safely on a hostile shore with surf and rocks? Can an overland caravan cross a dry stretch without reliable wells, and can it return with enough surplus to justify the risk? A route is not only distance, it is risk management. Storms, injury, conflict, and the simple problem of running out of time. Even when contact is possible, the burden of proof stays high, because humans are excellent at converging on similar solutions. Similar shapes can emerge from similar problems, using similar bodies, in similar landscapes, without any shared origin story. A tall stone is a simple solution to a complex desire, to make a place unmistakable. And once a place is unmistakable, it becomes easier to gather, to remember, and to argue over. Independent invention is not a dismissal of mystery, and it is not an insult to the builder's imagination. It's a claim that humans repeatedly converge on monumentality when certain pressures align, and when cooperation becomes a survival strategy. It suggests that the deep puzzle is not a hidden teacher, but a repeating social equation. When the variables line up, resources, routes, belief, competition, the result can look familiar across continents. We compare the four regions by materials because material is both constraint and choice, and it shapes what is even thinkable. Belgium offers glacial stones and workable local rock, but also centuries of reuse, where old stones become convenient quarries. In a landscape where stone is valuable, a standing stone can become a wall, a foundation, or a church threshold, and each reuse is a new chapter. The monument's afterlife becomes part of its meaning, not merely a loss. The camera lingers on the surfaces of Belgian stones pitted and lichen-stained, with tiny pockets where water sits after rain. Some are still upright, but many are missing, and the absence is itself a clue, like a sentence with words removed. A socket cut into subsoil can outlast the stone that once stood in it, and a ring of packing stones can survive like a ghost foundation. Even plough scars can curve around a buried obstacle, hinting at what used to be there. Chile offers surface pavements and desert varnish, where moving stones is optional and marking ground can be enough. In the Atacama, the desert itself becomes the medium, and the act is often subtraction, a careful removal rather than a heavy lift. Remove the dark varnished stones, expose the pale substrate, and a line appears, bright as a wound in the earth's skin. Over time, wind dusts it, footsteps refresh it, and the mark becomes a living maintenance problem. From ground level, the marks can be almost invisible, and that invisibility is part of their power. From a ridge, they begin to connect like faint handwriting across a page, and the eye starts to follow them instinctively. From the air, the logic becomes legible. Paths, figures, and decision points that guide movement, and sometimes guide attention toward water or shelter. The camera's altitude becomes a metaphor for interpretation, where meaning depends on vantage. Lebanon offers limestone beds that invite extreme quarrying, then demand extreme logistics, because the stone is cooperative but unforgiving. Limestone can be cut cleanly, but it is heavy, and its weight compounds quickly as dimensions grow. A block that looks like a simple rectangle becomes a problem of friction, slope, and coordination becomes a political resource. The quarry is not just a hole in the ground, it is a planning document written in scars. The lens moves across Baalbek's platform, then down to the quarry, and the transition feels like moving from claim to method. The scale is not only visual, it is bodily. Each step along a block's edge is a reminder of mass and of human limits. Nearby, tool marks and extraction trenches hint at planning that had to be precise, because mistakes at this scale are expensive. A miscut corner is not a cosmetic flaw. It is a structural risk and a labour disaster. Turkey offers limestone that can be carved and erected, then protected by deliberate infill, and that duality is central to the story. The same substance becomes standing, drawn, stacked, or hidden, depending on what the community needs the site to do. Infill is not just dirt. It is a deliberate act of closure that seals a moment in time, like folding a letter and putting it away. The buried pillars remain where they were set, but their meaning changes when they disappear from sight. We compare landscapes, because landscape is a partner in every build, shaping what survives and what is lost. Belgium's monuments sit in a crowded, wet, reworked terrain where traces vanish quickly, and where modern life presses hard on ancient ground. Soil chemistry, groundwater, and ploughing can erase shallow features, leaving only the most stubborn scars, and even those scars can be misread. The landscape is not stable background, it is an active process. In Belgium, the horizon is often soft, broken by hedges and low ridges, and the sky can feel close. Visibility changes with season, and fog can turn a field into a blank plain where direction is uncertain. In such conditions, a stone can be both a marker and a reassurance, a vertical certainty in a horizontal world. It can also be a meeting signal, visible above crops, above grass, above the small obstacles that fragment a route. Chile's marks sit in arid visibility, where surfaces preserve paths, alignments, and maintenance scars, and where distance is honest. Wind can move sand, but the core desert pavement can remain stable for long spans, like a locked surface. The dryness preserves the geometry, while also stripping away organic evidence that would make dating easier, and that trade-off shapes every interpretation. The desert gives clarity, but it withholds context. Lebanon's platform sits in a corridor valley that concentrates movement and power, and corridors are where history thickens. Valleys funnel caravans, armies, and pilgrims, and they also funnel ideas, styles, and administrative habits. A monumental platform in such a corridor is not merely architecture, it is a claim made in stone, visible to those who pass and difficult to ignore. The platform becomes a kind of geopolitical punctuation, forcing attention. Turkey's enclosures sit on hills that store stratigraphy, where burial becomes preservation and sequence becomes evidence. A hilltop can be a stage, but it is also an archive, and the archive is layered. Layer by layer, the ground records episodes of use, repair, and closure, sometimes separated by only a few seasons. When excavators peel back those layers, the site reveals not one act, but a rhythm of acts. Then we compare labour, because labour is the true common denominator, and it is where the abstract becomes measurable. Every case implies coordination beyond a household, even when the final form looks simple, and simplicity can be deceptive. Labour is where intention becomes measurable, because bodies have limits and time has costs, and those limits leave traces. A project that requires hundreds of person days implies planning, persuasion, and some mechanism of commitment. Standing stones require quarrying or selection, hauling, socketing, packing, and alignment checks, and each step has failure modes. The work includes many small tasks that rarely appear in photographs but dominate the day. Dig the pit, manage spoil, brace the stone, and tamp packing until the monument stops shifting, then check again after rain. Even the choice of packing material matters, because rounded stones behave differently than angular rubble. Geoglyphs require planning at scale, repeated maintenance, and shared agreement on what the mark means, because meaning is what makes maintenance worth doing. A line in the desert is easy to start, but hard to keep coherent across years, especially when routes shift. Someone must decide where it begins, where it ends, and how it stays legible, and that decision implies authority. Even a simple line can encode a social rule. Go this way, stop here, remember this place. Trillathons require quarry organisation, route preparation, hauling systems and precision placement, and scale multiplies risk. The larger the block, the less forgiving the geometry becomes, because small errors become large forces. A few degrees of tilt can turn a lift into a catastrophic slide, and a slide can kill workers and destroy months of preparation. At this scale, safety is not modern sentiment, it is project survival. Buried enclosures require quarrying, carving, erection, repeated use, then deliberate closure by filling, and closure is its own engineering. Closure is itself labour, and it is often overlooked, because it looks like disappearance rather than creation. Carrying fill, dumping it, levelling it, and sealing surfaces can take as much time as building, and it requires coordination too. Why spend that effort to hide what you just made, unless hiding is part of the meaning? The sharper question becomes unavoidable, and it presses on every frame of the montage. Why do people choose hard work that leaves no direct survival payoff, then keep returning to it, generation after generation? Why invest in stone when the same energy could build houses, clear fields, or hunt? And why accept the injuries that heavy work brings? What kind of social reward can compete with immediate subsistence, especially in harsh environments? We lay out shared drivers as testable hypotheses, not as one universal story, because universals can become lazy. Each driver predicts specific traces that can be sought, mapped, and dated, and those predictions keep interpretation honest. The goal is not to reduce wonder, but to make wonder accountable to evidence so it can survive criticism. Mystery that survives testing becomes deeper, not smaller. Hypothesis 1 is social cohesion through communal labour, where building is a mechanism for making a group feel real. If building is a bonding mechanism, we expect aggregation evidence, provisioning traces, and repeated construction episodes, rather than one isolated burst. Large groups leave signatures, hearths, food waste, temporary shelters, and patterned discard, often in short-lived layers. We also expect pathways and work areas worn by repeated feet, because gatherings create traffic. Communal labour also leaves organisational traces, because coordination tends to produce repeated solutions. Tool repair areas, quarry workshops, and standardised working surfaces can imply task specialisation, even without formal titles. Even without written plans, repeated procedures can be inferred from repeated patterns, like consistent socket dimensions or consistent dressing styles. The work becomes a tradition, and traditions have structure. In Belgium, that might appear as clustered monuments along routes and resource nodes, even when stones are gone and fields are rearranged. It can also appear as repeated socket forms that suggest shared practice, as if builders learned from builders. In Turkey, it might appear as repeated building protocols and patterned closure deposits, where the fill itself is structured. In both cases, repetition is the clue, because repetition implies teaching. In Chile, cohesion might appear as standardized iconography or repeated route marking conventions across caravan corridors, where travelers recognize a shared code. The same motif, repeated at intervals, can function like a shared language of travel, reducing conflict and confusion. In Lebanon, cohesion might appear as administrative organization and supply networks tied to monumental campaigns, visible in quarries, roads, and staging areas. Cohesion at imperial scale can look like bureaucracy, but it still depends on human buy-in. Hypothesis 2 is ritual calendars tied to seasonal resources, where monuments help coordinate time as much as space. If monuments track time, we expect alignments that repeat across structures, plus seasonal signals in faunal and botanical remains clustered around building phases. Timing matters when resources pulse, migrating herds, ripening plants, or predictable rains, and when people must decide when to gather. A shared calendar can reduce uncertainty, and uncertainty is costly. Seasonality can be read in bone growth rings, tooth eruption, and the species present in a deposit, which can indicate hunting or herding seasons. It can be read in charred seeds that indicate harvest periods, and in pollen that hints at flowering cycles. When these signals cluster around monument phases, they suggest gatherings tied to the year, not random visits. The calendar becomes social infrastructure, a schedule that binds people who live apart. Archaeoastronomy is treated as measurement, not romance, because the sky invites projection. Azimuths are tested against horizon profiles, statistical expectations, and the risk of cherry-picked alignments, which can fool even careful observers. A convincing case requires more than one alignment, because chance can mimic intention, especially in landscapes with many prominent peaks. Researchers also test whether alignments are practical to observe or only visible in ideal conditions. The horizon is not a flat line, and that matters for every sunrise and moonrise claim. A distant ridge can shift a sunrise point by degrees, changing what a monument points to and changing the date it would mark. Researchers model these effects, then ask whether the pattern is stronger than random placements and whether it repeats across nearby structures. If the same horizon notch matters repeatedly, it becomes less likely to be coincidence. Hypothesis 3 is territoriality and identity, where monuments claim a landscape without needing walls or armies. If that is true, we expect placement at boundaries, choke points, and visible thresholds, where recognition is unavoidable. Territorial markers do not need fortification, they need shared understanding and repeated acknowledgement. A marker works when people agree, even silently, that it means something. Belgian stones often sit near ridgelines, springs, and liminal zones that structure movement, and those zones are both practical and symbolic. Springs are practical, but they are also symbolic, places where the ground gives water, where the hidden becomes visible. Chilean geoglyphs often sit where routes converge, where decisions must be made, and where hesitation can be dangerous. A mark at a decision point becomes a rule written into the landscape. A convergence point in the desert is a social node, and nodes create predictable encounters. Travelers meet, exchange news, and negotiate passage, and they also exchange stories that reinforce shared geography. A mark at such a node does more than decorate. It stabilizes expectation and reduces uncertainty, which can prevent conflict. It tells you that others have been here and that the route has a social history. Lebanon's platform sits where empires pass and compete, turning a corridor into a statement that outlasts a campaign. Turkey's enclosures sit on rises that can be approached, seen, and remembered. And remembrance is a form of control. Height is not only visibility, it is also separation from daily life, a boundary between ordinary and set apart. A hilltop forces effort, and effort can be part of the meaning. Hypothesis 4 is elite competition and display, where monumentality becomes political theatre and scale becomes persuasion. If so, we expect hierarchy and access, differential investment, and evidence of patronage. Even if the names are lost, the monument becomes a stage where power is rehearsed and made credible, and where spectators learn their place. Architecture can teach obedience without a single spoken command. Baalbek fits this model strongly, because imperial building advertises control through scale and through technical refinement. Roman engineering, standardized masonry, and organized labor can be read as state capacity, visible in joints, courses, and the disciplined repetition of forms. Yet Turkey complicates it, because early monumentality can precede clear elites, and that unsettles easy explanations. If no palace appears, what is the source of coordination? That complication forces a deeper question, and it is one of the most unsettling in the series. If elites are not obvious, who coordinates, and why do others comply, especially when the work is dangerous and exhausting? The answer may involve ritual authority, charismatic leadership, or shared cosmology that makes labor feel necessary, even joyful. It may also involve reciprocity, where participation earns access, marriage ties, or protection. Hypothesis 5 is navigation and route marking, where monuments function as anchors in a mental map, and the map is social. If so, we expect chains of markers, sightline logic, and proximity to travel resources, because a lone marker is less useful than a network. A marker is most useful when it links to another marker, and when the spacing fits human travel stages. The landscape becomes legible through repetition. Chile's desert corridors make this hypothesis especially testable, because water points and caravan ecology can be modelled with realistic constraints. Distances between springs can be measured, and the spacing of marks can be compared to realistic travel stages, including rest and load limits. Belgium's waterways and ridges can be modelled too, though modern disturbance hides links and reroutes paths. Modelling does not prove intention, but it can show whether the pattern fits human movement. Navigation is not only about direction, it is about reassurance, and reassurance has psychological weight. In a featureless landscape, a mark confirms that others have passed this way, and that you are not alone in your risk. In a crowded landscape, a stone can confirm a boundary, a route, or a meeting place, reducing social friction. The monument becomes a stabilizer of expectation, which is a form of safety. Hypothesis 6 is ancestor veneration and memory architecture, where stone holds identity across generations and turns time into a place. If so, we expect reuse, repair, deposition patterns, and long monument life histories, because memory is maintained through action. Memory is not static. It is maintained through repeated acts like offerings, feasts, and repairs that keep a site socially alive. A monument can be less a finished object than a continuing relationship. Belgium's reuse in walls and churches becomes part of the monument story, not an afterthought, because reuse is a decision with meaning. Reuse can be practical, but it can also be appropriation, taking an old authority and embedding it in a new one, so legitimacy feels inherited. Turkey's deliberate burial can read as closure, preservation, or transformation of memory, depending on the deposits in the sequence. When a site is buried carefully, it can feel like an ending that protects what came before. We shift from meaning to mechanics, because scale can be quantified even when motives cannot, and quantification can discipline imagination. Archaeologists use energetics to estimate labour, time, and feasibility, translating stone into person days and risk. Energetics is not guesswork. It is applied physics constrained by archaeological context, and it becomes more reliable as measurements improve. It also forces uncomfortable clarity about what a community could realistically sustain. Energetics begins with volumes, densities, and distances, and each variable carries uncertainty. A stone's mass depends on measured dimensions and assumed density, and small density ranges become huge tonnage ranges at large volumes. Limestone, basalt, and granite differ, and weathering can change effective weight through fractures and voids that reduce integrity. Even the moisture content of a stone can shift weight slightly, and at scale, slightly matters. Researchers measure blocks with tapes, lasers, and photogrammetry, then build 3D models that can be checked and shared. The model allows volume to be estimated even when edges are irregular, chipped, or buried. From volume, mass follows, and mass drives every other calculation, from rope strength to braking needs. When the model is transparent, others can rerun it with different assumptions and see what changes. Transport estimates depend on friction coefficients, slope angles, ground bearing capacity, and the chosen hauling method, and each factor can dominate the outcome. A small change in assumed friction can halve or double required pulling force, and that changes the implied workforce dramatically. That is why experimental measurements on local soils and sled types matter, because laboratory numbers can mislead in real terrain. The ground is not an ideal surface, and monuments are built on real ground. Friction is not a constant. It changes with moisture, compaction, and surface preparation, and it can change within a single day. A wet clay track can become a trap, while a watered sand track can become smoother, and builders may exploit that. Timber rollers can reduce friction, but they also require straight paths and constant repositioning, which adds labour and coordination. A technique that looks efficient in a diagram can become slow in practice. Ground-bearing capacity matters because heavy loads sink, and sinking turns motion into struggle. If a block presses into soft soil, friction rises and movement stalls, and the track can be destroyed. Prepared tracks, brush mats, and stone paving can spread weight. Each solution trades time for reliability, and reliability can be worth more than speed. The camera follows a track edge, where compacted soil differs in colour and texture from the surrounding ground. Placement estimates depend on lift height, ramp geometry, lever advantage, and the need for control, because control is what prevents disaster. A model that moves a block is not yet a model that seats it precisely, with millimetre tolerances and joints. Precision requires slow movement, stable footing, and redundancy in ropes and supports, because one failure can cascade. Builders may have used cribbing, incremental lifts, and careful shimming, methods that leave subtle traces. Control is often the hidden cost, and it is the cost that determines whether an operation is repeatable. A block can be pulled forward by many people, but it must be stopped by someone, and stopped safely, without crushing feet or snapping ropes. Braking systems, chocks, and anchoring points may leave traces, though they are rarely preserved in open-air contexts. Even a line of post holes can hint at an anchoring frame that once controlled motion. Uncertainty is not a weakness in these calculations, it is the point, because honest ranges are more informative than false precision. Researchers report ranges, sensitivity tests, and which assumptions dominate the results so readers can see the logic. A good model tells you what you must know better and what you can safely approximate, and that guides new fieldwork. If friction dominates, you measure surfaces. If slope dominates, you map microtopography. Distance matters, but so does microtopography, and microtopography is where projects succeed or fail. A gentle detour can reduce slope costs, while a short steep segment can dominate the entire labour budget, forcing ramps or switchbacks. The camera follows a contour line showing how a route can avoid a single punishing incline, and how the landscape offers choices. Those choices imply planning, because the easiest route is rarely the straightest. Surface matters, because prepared tracks change friction and prevent sinking, but preparation is itself labour. Wetting, lubrication, and timbering can transform feasibility, but each adds its own labour costs, and those costs must be counted. A crew that waters a track must also carry water, and water is weight, and weight is labour. The arithmetic of effort becomes part of the story, and it is relentless. Coordination matters, because labour is not just muscle, and projects fail more often from mismanagement than from weakness. Scheduling, provisioning, tool maintenance, and risk management become part of the engineering model, even when no written records survive. People must eat, rest, and avoid injury, or the project collapses under its own strain, and strain leaves evidence. A sudden stop can leave abandoned tools, unfinished cuts, and half-prepared routes. Provisioning can be reconstructed indirectly, and indirect evidence can be surprisingly loud. Large gatherings require storage, cooking, and waste disposal, and they can shift local ecology through fuel demand and grazing pressure. Even when domestic structures are absent, a spike in animal bones or hearth features can signal organised events, especially if butchery patterns suggest feasting. The refuse becomes a ledger, recording what people consumed to make stone stand. We connect scale to the series hook because the hook is not only about stones, and it is not only about engineering. It is about missing records of planning, training, and command, and about the assumption that complexity requires writing. When a monument stands without a text, it challenges our assumptions about what literacy is needed for complexity, and what kinds of knowledge can be transmitted orally. Knowledge can live in routines, in apprenticeship, and in the memory of hands. The more we quantify, the more the mystery changes shape, and the shift is subtle but decisive. The question becomes less about whether it was possible, and more about how knowledge was organised, stored, and corrected. Who knew the sequence of steps? Who taught it? And how was error corrected when failure could be fatal? What did builders do when a block cracked, or when a ramp slumped, or when a rope snapped? We turn to landscape intelligence because monuments often sit where perception is heightened and where the world feels structured. Archaeologists test this with viewsheds, acoustics, water proximity, and horizon features, linking sensory experience to measurable variables. These are measurable properties, but they also shape emotion in ways that are hard to ignore, and emotion can be a tool of social cohesion. A place that feels special can become special through repeated use. Viewshed analysis models what can be seen from a monument and what can see it back, turning intuition into a map. Ridgelines, valley mouths, and river bends often maximize visibility and movement control, and those patterns can be tested statistically. In a GS model, the landscape becomes a field of probabilities, not just scenery, and the monument becomes a node in a network. The camera overlays a translucent cone of visibility, then pulls back to show how far it reaches. A viewshed is not only about surveillance, and reducing it to surveillance can miss the human point. It is about gathering, because people find each other more easily in visible places, and visibility reduces the cost of coordination. It is about signaling, because smoke, fire, and movement carry farther when the terrain cooperates, and signals can be ritual as well as practical. A visible hilltop can be a calendar marker, a meeting beacon, and a warning all at once. Horizon features matter for timekeeping and for narrative, because the sky is a shared reference that everyone can see. A notch, peak, or distant ridge can anchor repeated observations, even without written calendars, and repetition makes memory durable. When a community watches the same sunrise point migrate along the horizon, the year becomes a shared story, and stories coordinate behavior. The monument can become the place where that story is told, corrected, and confirmed. Acoustics can be tested with field measurements and modeling, and sound can be as architectural as stone. Some enclosures amplify voices or drums, shaping group experience and reinforcing social boundaries, even when walls are low. A chant that carries can make a crowd feel unified, even when individuals cannot see each other, and that unity can feel like proof. The camera holds on a ring of stone, while the soundscape tightens and brightens. Sound also interacts with architecture and terrain, and the interaction can be mapped. Stone surfaces reflect while soil and vegetation absorb, and wind can carry or scatter a voice depending on direction. A hilltop ring can create a focused acoustic zone, an invisible boundary that feels real to those inside it, even before they understand why. If a place sounds different, it can feel different, and feeling different can become ritualized. Water proximity is both practical and symbolic, and the two meanings reinforce each other. Springs, seasonal streams, and reliable wells structure routes, gatherings, and the plausibility of large work crews, because thirst is non-negotiable. Water is also a threshold substance, emerging from rock, disappearing into ground and returning with seasons, and thresholds invite story. A monument near water can be logistics, but it can also be cosmology. These landscape tests do not prove intent by themselves, and they are not meant to. They show whether placement choices systematically favour certain sensory and logistical advantages beyond what random placement would predict. If the pattern repeats across sites, chance becomes a weaker explanation, and design becomes more plausible. The landscape becomes less like backdrop and more like collaborator. We then confront preservation bias, because what survives is not what existed, and survival is uneven. Each region filters the past differently, creating a missing monument problem that can distort comparison. What we see is a curated sample, shaped by erosion, farming, politics, and accident, and the curation is unintentional. The past we reconstruct is partly the past that had the best conditions to endure. Belgium likely lost many sites to agriculture, quarrying, and stone reuse, and loss can be systematic. Negative evidence must be reconstructed through sockets, packing stones, maps, and place names, and through the subtle anomalies that surveys detect. A field name can preserve a memory long after the stone is gone. Stone field, giant's grave, devil's seat, words that carry folklore like sediment. Folklore is not data by itself, but it can point to where data might be. Old cadastral records and early antiquarian sketches can become data, even when they are imperfect. A 19th century note about a stone can guide a modern survey to a disturbed patch of ground, where geophysics may detect a socket. Even when the stone is missing, the disturbance pattern can remain, and the soil can remember what the eye cannot. The camera tracks a faded ink map, then dissolves into a modern drone shot of the same field. Chile preserves surface marks because aridity slows erosion and limits vegetation, and preservation can be deceptively clean. Yet organic materials vanish, and the very clarity invites misdating and sensational claims because the lines look recent. A line can look fresh for centuries, and without secure context it can be assigned to the wrong period or to the wrong culture. The desert preserves geometry, but it erases the small debris that would anchor time. Researchers use multiple strategies to reduce that risk, and the strategies are deliberately conservative. They study superposition, where one mark cuts another, and they examine desert varnish regrowth rates cautiously, aware of local variability. They also look for associated camps, ceramics, and root debris that can anchor a timeline, even if the evidence is sparse. A single sherd in the right place can matter more than 1,000 meters of line. Lebanon's platform survives partly through continuous reuse and rebuilding, which is both preservation and complication. Later phases protect earlier stones, while also obscuring construction sequences, and the protection comes with a cost. A wall can be both a shield and a mask, preserving mass while hiding method. A method is what we want to understand. The camera slides along a joint where stones from different phases meet, the seam visible like a timeline. Stratigraphy in such settings is complex, and complexity demands patience. Builders level, fill, and rebuild, and each episode can recycle earlier material, mixing evidence like shuffled cards. Untangling phases requires careful recording, micromorphology, and an acceptance that some sequences will remain ambiguous, at least for now. Sometimes the best result is a set of competing models, each tied to specific observations. Turkey's burial protected structures from weathering and later stone robbing, and that protection is a gift to archaeology. Yet burial also hides sites until modern excavation, skewing discovery toward what is accidentally revealed by roads, agriculture, or erosion. What remains unexcavated may be the majority, and that shapes our sense of rarity, making some phenomena look exceptional. The archive is incomplete, and the incompleteness is patterned. Preservation bias shapes global comparisons in subtle ways, and the montage can exaggerate those differences. We compare visible monuments in one region to lost monuments in another, then mistake the difference for culture when it may be taphonomy. The camera shows a clean desert line beside a muddy European field, and the contrast can mislead because visibility feels like importance. The discipline must constantly correct for what the camera naturally favours, so synthesis must include absence as data, and must model what is likely missing, not only what is present. Remote sensing, predictive modelling, and systematic survey become as important as excavation, because excavation alone samples too narrowly. A blank map is not a blank past, and archaeologists have learned to treat it as a question, not a conclusion. The most important site may be the one we have not yet found. We address modern myths and media, because pattern talk is where misinformation thrives, and where audiences are most vulnerable. Ancient mysteries sell because they promise one secret that explains everything, and one secret is easy to remember. A single origin story is easier to market than a careful range of possibilities, and it fits the rhythm of headlines. But the past is rarely that tidy, and tidiness can be a warning sign. Fringe narratives often exploit real gaps, then fill them with certainty, and certainty is seductive. They treat similarity as proof of a single origin, and they treat uncertainty as failure, as if caution were cowardice. The tactic is emotional. Turn caution into weakness and speculation into courage, then dare critics to disprove a story that was never properly tested. The result can be entertaining, but it can also be destructive. A rigorous documentary can keep wonder without abandoning method, and method can be cinematic. It can show how claims are tested, what would falsify them, and why some questions remain open, without pretending that openness is ignorance. It can let the audience feel the mystery, while also seeing the scaffolding of evidence, the careful steps that keep interpretation from collapsing. Wonder becomes stronger when it is earned. There is also an ethical dimension that cannot be postponed, because stories change behaviour on the ground. Sensationalism can drive looting, site damage, and the market for unprovenance artifacts, and that damage is permanent. When objects are ripped from context, the story they could tell is destroyed, and no later analysis can restore it. The loss is not only cultural, it is scientific, like tearing pages from an experiment log. Misinformation can also harm living communities by erasing local histories and replacing them with imported fantasies that feel glamorous. Protecting sites means protecting context, not just stones, and protecting the people who live with those sites. It means respecting that these landscapes are not empty stages, but homes and heritage with modern stakes. The camera holds on a fence line, a warning sign, and the quiet presence of a nearby town. We return to diffusion versus independent invention with a calmer, sharper frame, because the debate is often framed as a fight when it is really a spectrum. Diffusion is plausible when multiple independent lines converge, not when shapes merely rhyme across a screen. The strongest cases combine chronology, material links, and technological parallels that are hard to fake or explain away. When those lines do not converge, restraint is not boring, it is honest. Independent invention is plausible when constraints and human cognition predict similar solutions, and when social needs recur. Monumentality can be a convergent response to coordination problems and memory needs, especially when communities grow and interactions intensify. When people need a shared reference point, they often choose something that resists decay, because decay is social loss. Stone is not only durable, it is persuasive, because it looks like it has always been there. Sometimes the answer is mixed, because ideas can travel while methods localize, and that mix is historically realistic. A concept like marking a route can spread, while the material expression adapts to terrain, available stone, and local aesthetics. The same social function can be carved into stone in one place and scraped into desert pavement in another, without any contradiction. The function is the constant, the form is the adaptation. We build toward resolution by naming what future research can actually change, because not all uncertainty is equal. Better dating can tighten overlap tests and sequence models across regions, and that alone can dissolve many false connections. When timelines sharpen, false connections fade, and real connections become more visible, because the window of possibility narrows. A precise chronology is like focusing a lens, bringing some relationships into clarity and pushing others out. Higher resolution radiocarbon programs, Bayesian modeling, and careful sample selection can reduce ambiguity, especially when paired with transparent reporting. OSL can date sediments in sockets and fills, when bleaching and disturbance are controlled, and when the sampling is meticulous. These methods do not eliminate uncertainty, but they can narrow it, and narrowing changes the conversation. It turns speculation into constrained inference. Expanded excavations can test whether domestic signatures are truly absent or simply unexposed, and that distinction matters for every hypothesis. Wider area exposure can reveal activity zones, entrances, and work surfaces, and it can reveal what people did between ceremonies. Sometimes the key evidence sits just beyond an excavation trench, in a patch of soil that was never opened. The camera follows a trench edge, then pans to untouched ground, quiet with potential. Improved remote sensing can find the missing sites that would rebalance comparisons, and rebalancing is essential. LiDAR, high-resolution satellite imagery, drone photogrammetry, and multispectral analysis can map subtle traces that the eye misses in the field. A low mound, a faint soil mark, or a linear depression can become a new site, and a new site can change the pattern. Discovery is not just adding dots, it is changing the map's logic. Remote sensing is most powerful when paired with ground truth, because pixels are not proof. A spectral anomaly is a hypothesis until a shovel test confirms it, and confirmation requires careful context recording. The workflow is iterative. Scan, predict, verify, and refine, and each loop improves the next. In that loop, technology serves judgment, rather than replacing it. Open data comparisons can turn synthesis into a shared experiment, rather than a competition of narratives. Standardized reporting of measurements, alignments, and contexts allows patterns to be tested, not asserted, and it allows errors to be found. When datasets are comparable, debates become more empirical and less rhetorical, and the field moves faster. The camera shows a table of measurements dissolving into a 3D model, then into a landscape view. We also need more experimental archaeology tied to local conditions, because local conditions are where models succeed or fail. Experiments should report friction, slope, rope wear, and failure points, not just success stories that flatter the hypothesis. A failed attempt can be more informative than a triumphant reenactment, because failure reveals constraints. When a block refuses to move, the refusal is data. Experiments can also reveal hidden constraints, and hidden constraints often explain why traditions look the way they do. A rope that frays quickly changes how often a crew must stop and replace gear, and that changes scheduling. A sled that works on dry ground may fail on wet soil, forcing seasonal scheduling, and seasonality can become ritualized. Practical constraints can become cultural rules, and later generations may remember the rule without remembering the original reason. The goal is not to drain mystery, but to locate it precisely, so we know what we are actually wondering about. The unexplained often sits at the boundary between evidence and imagination, where the mind wants to leap. When we know what is plausible, we can focus on what is truly puzzling, and that focus makes the puzzle sharper. Mystery becomes a target, not a fog. When we connect the dots, the enigmas do not vanish, they become more nuanced, and nuance is a kind of resolution. The stones stop being isolated miracles and become recurring human choices under constraint, choices made with limited tools and rich social worlds. The question shifts from how could they to why would they, and that is a deeper problem, because it points to human psychology. It points to the ways groups create meaning that feels worth the cost. Across Belgium, Chile, Lebanon and Turkey, the shared pattern is not a single blueprint, and it is not a single origin story. It is a repeated willingness to invest labour in places that organise time, identity and power, and to keep investing even when the payoff is symbolic. Monumentality becomes a technology of society, an external structure that helps hold an internal order, especially when populations grow and relationships become complex. Stone becomes a social tool, not merely a material. This chapter is the climax because it changes what the series is really asking, and it changes what we listen for in the silence. Not how they did it once, but why humans keep doing it, even when records disappear and names are lost. Why so many cultures, facing different ecologies, arrive at the same costly decision, and why that decision keeps resurfacing. Are monuments a solution to a problem we still have? The problem of making shared reality feel solid. From 4 landscapes, we move into one final reckoning with confidence and humility, because the evidence demands both. We can say what the evidence supports, and we can show how it supports it, without pretending the case is closed. We can name what remains unknown, and we can name what would change our minds. The camera slows, letting the sights breathe, as if giving the viewer time to weigh the claims. Transition into the final chapter begins with a quiet return to the ground, where the work actually happened. The camera drops from aerial views to the texture of soil, gravel and chisel scars. Accidents of geology, but decisions repeated across seasons, measured by footsteps, sightlines, and the patient memory of a community. In principle, engineering is often explainable through leverage, ramps, friction control, sequencing, and patient labour organised by shared rules. A sled becomes plausible when you add wetted soil, rollers, and coordinated pulling rhythms that reduce peak force. Stone behaves predictably under compression, but it fails under tension. So builders learn where to support, where to brace, and when to pause. Even without writing, knowledge can be stored in practice, apprenticeship, ritualized steps, and the quiet authority of those who have done it before. The deeper enigma is motive, because meaning erodes faster than stone, and context is what time steals first. A monument can outlast its language, while its purpose, grave, gathering place, boundary, promise, thins into speculation. Some unknowns remain genuinely unresolved at extreme scales, including precise construction sequences for the trilithons and their final placement logic. Other gaps are social, including the full function of certain desert marks and the reasons some monuments were deliberately buried. Burial can be protection, closure, or power, an intentional act that turns architecture into a sealed message. We separate unknowns we can test through dating, sourcing, stratigraphy, and experiment from unknowns we may never recover, like lost speech and names. Radiocarbon anchors charcoal to a century, isotopes trace stone to a quarry, and soil layers reveal whether a wall rose quickly or over generations. Yet no instrument can fully retrieve a joke, a vow, or the private grief that might have driven hands to lift. From synthesis, we return to stewardship. Protect sites, respect descendant communities, and resist sensational claims that erase human achievement. Under the night sky, the stones remind us history is not behind us. It is beneath us, waiting in darkness, under roots and dust, for careful questions rather than easy answers. What will we choose to remember before the ground closes again? Across Belgium's robbed-out fields, Chile's desert corridors, Lebanon's colossal terraces, and Turkey's sealed hilltops, the pattern never became supernatural, it became human. We found precision without blueprints, coordination without archives, and monuments that survive as measurements long after motives fade. The stones taught the same lesson in different dialects. Preservation decides what we can see, and absence can be evidence, but never a license for fantasy. In Belgium, a lone menhir and a scatter of sockets hinted at a vanished landscape, where reuse in walls and churches rewrote prehistory into negative space. In Chile, dryness kept paths, geoglyphs, and cairns startlingly legible. Yet the desert's clarity still refused to explain why people maintained marks across lifeless distances. In Baalbek, the trilithons and the quarry's unfinished giants made the engineering question feel sharp, then reminded us that empires build with spectacle as much as stone. And in Turkey, stratified floors and deliberate backfill turned burial into architecture, suggesting that closure can be as intentional as construction. Thread by thread, our toolkit kept returning. Radiocarbon and OSL probabilities, petrography and geochemical sourcing, tool marks, micromorphology, remote sensing, viewsheds, least cost paths, and experiments with friction, ramps, and leverage. Each method narrowed the range of stories we could tell, while also exposing the missing middle, where names, songs, and instructions once lived. What remains unresolved is not the reality of planning, but the chain of decisions. Who convened the labour, how knowledge was stored and corrected, and what counted as success. The deeper surprise was causal, and it ran against modern intuition, especially in the earliest enclosures of Anatolia. Monumentality did not always wait for surplus. It may have helped create it, pulling people together until gathering became staying, and staying became cultivation. That possibility links the desert route marker to the standing stone, the trilithon to the buried ring. Each is a technology of shared memory, making time, territory, and belonging feel solid. Still, the grammar of placement remains partly opaque, even when the stones are perfectly measured. Why this ridge and not the next? Why this horizon notch? Why clusters here and isolation there? Why lift the biggest blocks high? Why seal a sanctuary under rubble like a message meant to outlast its readers? Our confidence ends where the evidence ends, and that boundary is not a failure. It is the discipline that keeps wonder honest. So who moved them, and how did they do it? When the trail goes dead and the sky still feels like a countdown, the most responsible answer is also the most unsettling. People did with learned engineering and organised labour, and the unwritten part is not the method alone, but the meaning that once made the work necessary. The stones were never proof of impossibility. They were proof of coordination, training, and authority operating beyond our surviving records. What crucial pieces are missing is not a secret machine, but the social instructions, how knowledge travelled, who held it, and why communities chose costly monumentality to anchor reality. Until we recover more dates, more sequences, more sourcing, and more contexts, the question shifts from could they to what did they believe was worth building into the earth. In the end, these discoveries do not mock the past. They expose the limits of our own imagination, and they ask us to measure carefully before we mythologize. The most unexplained thing may be the simplest. Humans keep turning stone and soil into memory, and when the words are gone, the landscape keeps speaking anyway. Some answers will arrive with better surveys, cleaner samples, and slower, more patient excavations, but some will never return, because grief, awe, and obligation do not fossilize. Yet that is the quiet power of these monuments. Each one is a reminder that history is not only what happened, but what was remembered, and what was deliberately sealed away. If we want the next chapter to be written with evidence instead of rumor, we have to protect these places, support careful research, and learn to value uncertainty as part of the truth.